Snow came sideways that night, not falling, attacking. A black sky split by lightning. 3,000 animals screaming under hooves like drum fire. One rider cut hard toward the front. The ground gave way, something small, ordinary, indifferent. Bone cracked. The world went white. Years later, the same man pushed through knee-deep drifts toward a crooked depot light. One crutch punching holes. One leg dragging a long, dark furrow. The door slammed shut behind him. Inside, a single bench, occupied. A figure who took up the whole of it. Shoulders like a doorframe, eyes that did not look away. Outside, the wind rose higher. The fire burned low. And somewhere past the white, a fence line and a dead man's unfinished business waited patient, silent, already moving closer. Snow. Nothing but snow. It came sideways that night, not falling, attacking. The kind of storm old men in this territory would talk about for 20 years after, sitting by their stoves, saying, "I was there like it was something to survive instead of something to endure." Emmett Cordell had been walking into weather like this his whole life, except this time there was no herd to bring in, no fence to mend before dark, just him, one duffel, one crutch, and 40 miles still standing between him and a house he'd never once set foot inside. His uncle's house. His house now, though it didn't feel like his. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He'd left the letter folded inside his coat, the paper gone soft and yellow at the creases from being read too many times on trains and in waiting rooms and on the backs of wagons headed nowhere in particular. To my nephew Emmett, in the event of my passing, the property known as the Cordell Homestead. He knew the words by heart now. Didn't need to read them anymore. Read them anyway. Because a man traveling alone in winter needs but something to hold on to besides his own thoughts. And thoughts, for Emmett, had a way of circling back to the same gulch, the same lightning, the same sound his leg made when the horse rolled over it. He tried not to think about that part. Failed. Mostly because the mind doesn't ask permission. It just goes there. Back to the noise, that was the thing nobody warned him about. Not the pain. Not even the blood. But the noise, 3,000 animals screaming at once under a black sky, split open by lightning, hooves like drum fire coming from every direction because there was no away from it anymore, no direction that was safe. He remembered turning his horse hard toward the lead steers, remembered the gulch, waiting past the rise, invisible in the dark, remembered thinking if they hit that at a run, it's over, it's all of it over, men included. And he remembered doing the only thing he knew how to do, which was ride straight at the front of a stampede and scream louder than the thunder until the leaders broke and turned. They turned, which was the last clean thought he had, because that was when the ground gave way. Beneath his horse, a burrow, a rabbit hole, something small and ordinary, and completely indifferent to the size of the disaster it was about to cause, and the animal went down at a dead run. And Emmett went down with it, and something happened to his leg that he didn't have words, for even now, 4 years on, he just had the sound, a sound no leg is supposed to make, until somebody was pulling him free of the horse, until somebody was yelling for the doctor, until the world went white and then black, and then, much later, gray, the particular gray of a bunkum tousling, and the particular gray of understanding, slow and complete, that the leg below his knee wasn't there anymore and wasn't coming back. He shook his head. Once. Hard. The way a man shakes water off after going under too long. Enough of that. Which was why, when the wind found him 3 miles outside Widow's Bend and near took the hat clean off his head, he almost laughed instead of cursed. Because at least the storm was an honest kind of trouble. At least the storm didn't pretend to be sorry before it hurt you. The depot appeared out of the white, like something conjured. A low, dark shape against the endless gray. One window glowing amber, and Emmett pushed it toward it with his crutch punching holes in drifts that came near up to his knee, his good one, anyway, and his bad leg dragging a furrow behind him the whole way. Everything about the building looked half surrendered to the weather. Already, the sign above the door, Widow's Bend, hung crooked on one hinge, swinging just enough in the wind to knock against the wood siding. A slow and tired rhythm like a clock nobody had bothered to fix. Icicles the length of a man's forearm had formed along the eave and looked ready to drop at the first hard gust. Somewhere behind the building, a shutter banged, loose, forgotten, over and over, and Emmett found himself thinking, absurdly, that the whole structure sounded the way his leg felt on a night like this, held together, mostly by stubbornness and not much else. He almost turned back. For one bad, cold second, with the wind cutting through his coat like it had a personal grievance against him. He thought about the platform behind him, the last town, a warm room he could have paid for if he'd been willing to wait out the weather in comfort instead of pushing on toward a house that wasn't even finished waiting for him yet. But turning back had never been a thing Emmett Cordell was especially good at. Not on the range. Not with the leg. Not now. So he pushed on toward the light instead. He reached the door, shouldered it open because his hands were full of crutch and cold, and there wasn't a free one left for the handle. The wind screamed through the gap like it resented losing him. The door slammed shut behind him. Hard. Final, and there it was, warmth. A little. A stove in the corner coughing out heat like it resented the job too. A lantern hanging crooked from a nail, and a bench, long, wooden, old, occupied. Not by two people, not by three. By one woman who took up the whole thing like she'd been poured into it. Emmett stopped in the doorway, snow sliding off his shoulders in wet clumps onto the floorboards. His bad leg throbbing the way it always did in weather like this, a dull ache where the knee used to end and the wood began. And for a moment all he could do was stand there and look, because she was enormous. That was the plain truth of it, and there was no sense pretending otherwise. 7 feet if she was an inch. Shoulders like a doorframe. Hands folded in her lap like 2 loaves of bread set out to cool. A leather valise the size of a small trunk sitting at her feet like it weighed nothing to her, though it would have taken 2 ordinary men to lift it between them. He looked at the bench, looked at her. She didn't look away first. That was the thing he'd remember later, longer than the size of her, longer than anything else about that first minute. Not the size. The way she looked at him straight on, no pity in it, no curiosity dressed up as politeness, no flinch and no stare either. Just looked, waited, like she already knew what he was going to ask and had already decided privately how she felt about it and wasn't going to hand him the answer for free. He asked anyway, "Is this seat taken?" 4 words. That's all he had in him. His jaw too cold for more. His pride too thin to risk more. Because if she said no, if she looked at the wooden leg and the crutch and said there's no room, Cowboy, he didn't know what he'd do with that. Stand in the corner all night, probably. Same as always, same as every depot, every church pew, every crowded room he'd walked into since the stampede, waiting to see who would make space and who would make excuses. She didn't say no. She didn't say yes, either. She shifted, one hip, then the other, pulled herself in against the armrest like a ship easing into a smaller berth, and just like that, there was a space. Not much. Enough. It is now, she said. Nothing else. No smile, no small talk. Just those 3 words, and then her eyes went back to the frozen window, like the conversation was already finished. Like she'd spent her ration of words for the evening, and didn't intend to spend more on him just yet. Emmett sat, because what else was there to do? Because his leg was screaming, and his pride was worn, thin as his coat, and this woman, who didn't flinch, didn't stare, to help him lower himself down like he was made of glass. This was the first ease he'd felt in 3 days of traveling. He settled the crutch against his knee, set the duffel at his feet, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all, which was fine, which was honestly a relief. The station master came through the far door not long after, stomping snow off his boots, hollering something about the eastbound being delayed. Indefinitely. Track buried past Miller's Pass. Nobody moving until the storm broke, and by the sound of the wind outside, the storm had no intention of breaking anytime soon. A few groans went up around the room. An old man by the stove, Abel Whitcomb. He'd introduce himself soon enough. though nobody had asked, muttered something about his daughter waiting on him in Bozeman, and how she'd worry herself sick if he didn't turn up by Christmas Eve. A young couple near the ticket window exchanged a look that needed no words at all. Thomas and Nell Merrick, married 8 months, traveling to his mother's for the holiday, both of them still new enough to marriage that they hadn't yet learned to hide their disappointment from each other. Emmett said nothing, because what was there to say? Nobody was waiting on him except a rotted-out ranch house 40 miles northwest that had belonged to his uncle, and that house wasn't going anywhere. It would still be sagging and empty tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. A man's inheritance doesn't get impatient the way a family does. The woman beside him didn't react at all. Not a sigh, not a shift. She reached down, opened the clasp on that heavy leather valise, and pulled out a small notebook, worn soft at the corners, like it had traveled a long way in her hands. Flipped it open, started writing, unhurried, like the storm outside was somebody else's problem entirely. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. She caught him. "Something on my face, cowboy?" Not sharp, not friendly either, just flat. Testing. "No, ma'am," he said. "Just wondering what a person writes down on a night like this." "Complaints, mostly," she said, and went back to it. He almost smiled. Almost. He didn't ask what kind of complaints. Didn't ask her name yet, either, though it sat right there on the tip of his tongue, the whole furt unspoken, unsquid, because some part of him understood without being told, without knowing why, that this was not a woman a man rushed. This was a woman who gave things out on her own schedule, in her own measure, and a man who tried to hurry her would only get less for the trying. So he waited and, eventually, without either of them quite marking the moment it happened, names got exchanged. Emmett Cordell, Odessa Calloway. Said plain, without ceremony, the way two strangers share names when they've already mighty somewhere, beneath the words that they're not going to be strangers for very much longer. The wind got worse before it got better, and it didn't get better for a long, long time. By the second hour, the windows had frosted opaque, thick white feathering across the glass, like someone breathing on it from the other side. The stove had burned through most of its wood, and the station master hadn't stocked much, because why would he? Trains ran on schedule most winters. Storms passed through in an evening. Nobody expected to be trapped in a 10 by 30 room with strangers until the sky decided otherwise. Except this storm didn't care about schedules, and the wood ran low. Emmett watched the flames shrink, watched the room's collective mood shrink along with them. Abel pulled his coat tighter, and the dying fire like it owed him something. Nell Merrick had gone quiet, her head on her husband's shoulder, and Thomas kept glancing toward the woodpile like he expected it to solve itself if he looked hard enough. Nobody moved to fix it. So Odessa did. She stood, all of her, unfolding out of that bench like a tent, going up, and the whole room seemed to lean back an inch just from the sight of it. She crossed to the woodpile in the corner, what was left of it, 3 logs, and some kindling somebody had given up on, and she picked up the entire remaining stack. One arm, like it was nothing, like it was a basket of laundry. Nobody said a word, because what do you say to that? She fed the stove log by log, methodical, and the fire came back up gold and hungry, and the room exhaled with it. Thomas murmured a thank you. Odessa nodded once. Didn't linger for the gratitude. Didn't seem to want it, or need it, the way most people need to be thanked for kindness before they'll believe they've done any. Emmett tried to help. He shifted his weight onto the crutch, started to push himself up, because a man ought to at least offer, even a man with one leg, even a man who knew he'd be slower and clumsier than useful, and the leg didn't cooperate. It never did in the cold. The joint at the wood seized up like it resented being asked to work at all, let alone work well. He caught himself on the armrest. Didn't fall, but it was close, and everyone in the room saw it, and that was worse than falling. Odessa didn't rush to catch him. She didn't pretend not to notice either. She just set one final log down. Close, within his reach, without him having to stretch for it, without him having to ask. A small thing, the smallest thing, but it landed different than if she'd handed it to him directly, different than if she'd hovered, different than every well-meaning stranger who'd ever tried to carry his bag for him like his legs were the only part of him that worked. She let him place it in the stove himself. He did. Slow, his hands shaking slightly from the cold, or maybe from something else. But he got it in and the fire took it and he sat back down beside her with his jaw tight and his pride, for once, mostly intact. "Thank you," he said. Quiet. "Wasn't for you," she said. "Wood doesn't care who feeds it." But she'd left the log close enough for him. She'd done that on purpose. He knew it. She knew he knew it. Neither of them said anything more about it, and somehow that was the exact right amount of nothing to say. The talk, when it came slow, the way ice melts. Not all at once a drip here, a crack there, until eventually a person looks up and realizes the whole surface has changed underneath them. "Where are you headed?" Emmett asked, because the silence had gone on, long enough that it started needing something to interrupt it, and because it was found against his own expectation that he wanted to know. Odessa didn't answer right away. "Anywhere," she finally said, "that people don't look at me like I'm a draft horse for sale." She said it plain. No self-pity dressing it up. No bitterness sharpening it, either. Just fact, laid down flat the way she laid down everything. Emmett turned that over. Didn't rush to fill the space after it with something comforting. Something that would have sounded hollow anyway. "I know something about being looked at," he said instead. "Do you?" Man loses a leg, people stop seeing the rest of him. He tapped the wood below his knee, a short, dry knock, like knuckles on a door. Nobody was going to answer. Doesn't matter how the rest of him works. All they see is what's missing. Odessa's eyes moved to the leg, not lingering. The way strangers stared at, cataloging, calculating, just acknowledging it and moving on the way a person notes a scar on somebody's hand and thinks nothing further of it. "Does it slow you down?" she asked. "Truly? Wooden leg doesn't make me slower than half the men I've known with two good ones," he said. "Most men waste their legs standing around complaining. Least mine's got an excuse." That got something out of her. Not a laugh. Not quite. But the corner of her mouth moved, a fraction, like a door easing open a crack before somebody decided against opening it all the way. "That's the first joke anybody's told me in a long while," she said. "Wasn't sure it was a joke till it came out my mouth," he admitted. "Might have just been the truth. Can't it be both?" "I suppose it can." Outside, the wind found a new pitch, higher, meaner, rattling the window glass in its frame like it wanted in on the conversation. The lantern flame dipped and steadied. Abel, by the stove, had gone quiet, his chin dropping toward his chest, worn out from the mere effort of worrying about a daughter, 3 days' ride away. The Merricks had drawn close together on the far bench, sharing a coat between them, sharing warmth, sharing whatever unspoken understanding kept a young married couple from needing words at all. Emmett and Odessa didn't have that kind of understanding yet, but something had started. Small. Unfinished. Like the first log catching before the rest of the fire follows. There was one blanket in the depot, worth using a rough wool thing. The station master dug out of a cabinet with an apology already loaded into his voice. "It's not much, folks. Storm caught us all off guard, and it ended up, without much discussion, spread across the bench. Emmett and Odessa shared." She sat upright against the wall, spine straight, like even in sleep she intended to take up exactly the space she needed and not an inch more out of guilt for it. Emmett lay along the length of the bench, curled where the space allowed, his crutch propped within arm's reach, because a man like him slept the way he lived, ready to move if he had to, ready to defend the little dignity he had left. The fire cracked. The wind screamed. And somewhere in that narrow, borrowed dark, two strangers, who had never met before that evening, fell asleep 6 inches apart, closer than either of them had let anybody get in years. Morning didn't bring relief. It brought more snow. Emmett woke to the gray half-light of a blizzard sky and the sound of Abel coughing by the stove, And for a moment he didn't know where he was that particular blank half second every traveling man knows, waking in a strange room, waiting for the world to reassemble itself around him. Then he remembered the bench, the woman, the three words, "It is now." He sat up, careful. His wooden leg had gone stiff overnight, the joint locked up tight from the cold that had crept in around the stove's dying coals. And getting himself upright took longer than it should have, longer than he wanted anyone to witness. Odessa was already awake, already at the window, working a thumbnail against the frost to clear a spy hole through the glass. "Snow's past the fence line," she said, not turning. "Whole world's gone white out there. Train's not moving today. Train's not moving for a good while, I'd guess." She said it without complaint, like a woman reciting a fact of weather rather than a disruption to her plans. And Emmett found himself wondering, not for the first time since the night before, what kind of life taught a person to take bad news that flat, that unbothered, as if she'd used up her capacity for outrage on something much larger, much earlier, and simply had none left over for a delayed train. He'd find out soon enough, sooner than he expected, though not soon enough to spare either of them the telling. The morning passed in small tasks. Abel needed help getting to the outhouse and back through the drifts, and it was Odessa who went with him, an arm under his elbow, patient with his slow, careful steps in a way that surprised nobody who'd watched her the night before, but would have surprised anyone who only saw her from a distance and made assumptions about a woman her size. "You've done this before," Abel said, midway through the drift, breathing hard from the cold and the effort. "Helped somebody along who needed helping. Comes natural to you. Had a grandmother," Odessa said, "before she passed. Nobody else in the family would trouble themselves to walk slow enough for her. I didn't mind it." "Why not, if you don't mind an old man asking?" "Because she was the only one who never once told me to make myself smaller," Odessa said. "Not my voice, not my laugh, not my hands at the supper table. Everybody else in that house spent my whole childhood teaching me to apologize for the space I took up. She never did. Seemed only fair I'd walk slow for her, considering." Abel was quiet a moment, boots crunching through the snow. "Sounds like a woman worth remembering." "She is," Odessa said. "Every day." They didn't speak again until they reached the door, but something in the silence between them had gone easier than before, the way silence does between two people who've traded something true and found it didn't cost either of them anything to give. Thomas, meanwhile, fussed over the stove, feeding it kindling too fast, and Emmett steadier now. The leg loosened up with movement showed him how to bank it properly, how to make the wood last, a skill picked up from years of cold nights on cattle drives that had never once been useful to anyone until this exact morning in this exact room. "You've got a patience for teaching," Thomas said, watching Emmett's hands work. "Ever think of taking on hands of your own, out at this ranch you're headed to?" "Never had reason to think that far ahead," Emmett admitted. "Didn't figure I'd make it past the first winter, honestly. Land's been empty a long while. Fences down. House probably half caved in by now. But you're going anyway." "It's mine," Emmett said. Like that answered the whole question, and in a way to him it did. Food had gone thin by mid-morning. Hardtack, and not much of it. Coffee grounds stretched twice past where they should have been stretched, thin and bitter, and barely warm by the time it reached the last cup poured. The station master apologized for it more than once. A nervous, over-explaining sort of man who seemed to feel the storm's cruelty as a personal failing of his own hospitality, though nobody blamed him for weather no man could have predicted. Nobody complained out loud about the food, though the complaining showed up other ways, in shorter tempers, in longer silences, in the way Dutch Pruitt and Royal Sutter, two'd kept who'd mostly to themselves the first night, started muttering to each other in the far corner with a restlessness that had nowhere else to go. Odessa split her own share of hardtack without being asked and passed half of it toward Emmett's of the bench. "You don't need to do that," he said. "Didn't ask whether I needed to," she said. "Eat it before I change my mind." He ate it. Emmett noticed the muttering in the corner too. Filed it away the way a man files away weather signs before a storm and change in the wind, a certain color to the sky, not yet knowing what shape trouble would take when it finally broke, only knowing with the particular certainty of a man who'd survived one stampede already that it was coming. It was midday, with the wind still howling and the food supplies dwindling further, that the conversation between Emmett and Odessa turned again. Deeper this time, the way conversations do when people have run out of small things to say and are left only with the large ones. You asked yesterday where I was headed, Odessa said. She was seated again, the notebook closed in her lap, her hands resting on top of it, like she was keeping something contained inside that hadn't earned its way out yet. I told you anywhere. That wasn't the whole truth. Emmett waited. Didn't push. He'd learned, somewhere in 4 years of being the man people didn't quite know how to talk to, that the truth came faster when you didn't chase it. There was a wedding, she said. 2 years back. East of here. Ohio. Yours? Mine. A short, humorless breath, not quite a laugh. Or so everybody was told. My family arranged it. A man named Corliss Vane. Rich. Odd. Willing to pay a sum of money that made my father's eyes go bright as a lit match the day the offer came. Go on, Emmett said when she paused too long. Except it wasn't a wedding, she continued. Not really. It was a show. Her fingers tightened briefly on the notebook. My father sold tickets. Charged $1 a head for people to come see the bride. $2 to shake her hand. If you can believe there were men willing to pay double just to feel how big my hand was next to theirs. Emmett's stomach turned, slow and cold, though his face didn't show it. He let her keep the floor. They built a stage, she said, an actual stage, in the church hall, so the whole crowd could see me stand up there in a dress 6 sizes too small, because nobody could be bothered to have one made proper for a woman my size. Cheaper to laugh at the seams, splitting than to pay a seamstress fair wage, I suppose. And at the height of it, when the whole room was packed in, tight laughing, pointing Corliss Vane stood up in front of everyone and said he couldn't go through with marrying a monstrosity. The word hung there. Ugly. Deliberate. She said it the way a person handles a knife they'd been cut by before carefully, at a distance, but without flinching from it either. That was the show, she said. The rejection. That was always the plan, near as I've pieced it together since. My father got his money either way. Ticket sales don't refund on account of a broken engagement, and I expect Corliss Vane got some of his own for playing his part so convincingly. Emmett sat with that. Truly sat with it, the way you sit with news too heavy to respond to quickly. They sold tickets, he finally said, to watch you get humiliated. They sold tickets, Odessa said, to watch a giant get put back in her place. That's how the posters read. Near enough. I saw one. Somebody left it tacked outside the hall for a week afterward, like a keepsake, my own face drawn on it, twice life-size, grinning like a carnival attraction. And your family collected the money. Split it 3 ways, my father told me later, like that was meant to comfort me somehow, that even my brother got a cut, that the whole arrangement had been fair and equal among the people selling me. She looked at him then, direct, unflinching, the way she'd looked at him from the bench the night before. I left 3 days after, took what I could carry, and I haven't been back. The wind pushed against the window glass, hard, insistent, and for a moment it was the only sound in the room. I'm sorry, Emmett said. Simple. No embellishment, because embellishment would have cheapened it. Don't be, Odessa said. You didn't sell the tickets. No, but I know something about being made into a spectacle. She looked at him, waiting. The stampede, he said. 4 years back. I was riding drag on a herd for the Bramwell outfit. 3,000 head in a lightning strike spooked the lead steers. Whole herd turned at once. All that noise and dust and no way to see 10 feet in front of your own horse. I got cut off from the rest of the crew, tried to bring the front runners around. Before they hit a gulch that would have killed half the herd, and maybe some of the men working the far side of it. Did it work? Turned them. Saved the herd. Cost me the leg. He said it the way a man says something he's said many times before. worn smooth from repetition, all the sharp edges filed down by years of retelling it to doctors, to strangers, to himself in the dark when sleep wouldn't come. Horse went down in a prairie dog hole at a dead run. Leg got caught underneath when we rolled. By the time they dug me out, there wasn't much of it left below the knee worth saving. Doc back at the ranch did what he could with a bone, saw, and a bottle of whiskey, and I don't remember most of it, and what I do remember, I try not to. And the Bramwell outfit paid the doctor, gave me 2 weeks to heal up as best I could. His voice went flatter here, not angry, just tired in the specific way. Old wounds make a man tired. Then let me go. Foreman came to see me himself, said a kind Ivan. Said, Emmett, you did us a real service out there. Ain't a man on this outfit doesn't know it. Then said they needed men who could ride a full day without needing to rest the leg, and handed me my last pay. And that was that. They fired you, Odessa said, for saving them, for being broken afterward. The saving part, they were happy enough to take for free. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The stove popped. Abel snored softly by the wall. Somewhere behind them, Nell hummed something low and tuneless to her husband. A private comfort neither Emmett nor Odessa were meant to hear. So we're a matched pair, Odessa finally said. Both of us proof that people only value what's useful to them. Once you stop being useful, once you're inconvenient, they find a way to put you outside the fence. Something like that. And yet, here you are, she said, traveling somewhere in the dead of winter with a bad leg and no fear of it. Where are you headed, Emmett Cordell? That's worth all this. He almost smiled at the sound of his own name in her voice the first time she'd used it. He realized, though he'd given it to her the night before, along with hers. My uncle has passed fall, he said. Left me a spread of land northwest of here. Small house. Fallen down fences. Nobody's worked it in years. He shrugged. One shoulder. It's not much. But it's mine, and nobody can fire me from owning it. No, Odessa agreed. They can't. She said it like she meant something larger by it than the literal words, and Emmett didn't press her on what. There was a lull after that. The kind that comes after a hard conversation, when both people need somewhere to put their hands and their eyes that isn't each other for a little while. Odessa busied herself with the notebook again, though this time she didn't hide the page from him when he glanced over. Rows of numbers, dates, a tally of something he couldn't quite make sense of at a distance. What is it? He asked, if you don't mind telling. All that writing. She considered the question longer than it seemed to need. A record, she finally said. Every place I've been paid less than I was owed. Every promise a man made me that he didn't keep. My father's debts to me, mostly. What he took in ticket money. What he told the town it cost to feed a daughter my size, which was a lie. By the way, I've never eaten more than an ordinary woman eats twice over, whatever the posters wanted people to believe. Why keep the tally? Because somebody ought to remember it true, she said. If I don't write it down, the only version of that day that survives is the one my father tells at supper to make himself sound clever. I'd rather there be a second version. Mine. Emmett turned that over. It sat close, somehow, to the reason he still carried, his father's knife, though he'd never once needed it for anything but whittling and cutting ropes and things a man keeps, not because they're useful, but because letting them go would mean letting go of something truer than the object itself. My father carried this, he said, drawing the knife an inch from its sheath, just enough to show the worn bone handle, and sliding it back before it could be mistaken for anything but what it was. Died when I was 19. Never said much to me my whole life. Wasn't that kind of man. But he gave me this the week before he passed, and he said, a man doesn't need many words, if his hands know their business. That's the only thing my leg's ever really taken from me, if I'm honest. Not the running, not the riding. Just knowing my hands still know their business when half the counties decided otherwise. Your hands know their business, Odessa said. Simple. Certain. The way she said most things. You've known me a day. I've watched you bank a stove fire like a man who's done it 1,000 times in weather. Twice this bad, she said. I've watched you stand back up after falling. without asking anybody's pity for it. A day's enough, sometimes. Longer than some people ever give you. He didn't have an answer for that. Just let it sit there, warm, between them, while the wind kept working at the windows, and the light kept fading toward another long dark. Abel Whitcomb, when he woke fully from his midday doze, seemed to need company more than food, and it was Odessa, again, who gave it to him, though Emmett found himself drawn in soon enough, too. 51 years married, Abel said, apropos of nothing, staring at the stove like it might show him something in the flames. Buried her this spring. Now it's just me and a daughter in Bozeman, who worries after me like I'm made of glass. Same as you, young man. A nod toward Emmett's leg, not unkind. Whole world gets to treating you delicate once you cross a certain line. Don't matter if the line is age or an injury or the shape the good Lord happened to build you in. This last with a glance toward Odessa. Careful, not unkind either. Some of us cross more than one line, Odessa said. Dry. Some of us do, Abel agreed. But I'll tell you both something. For what an old man's opinion is worth on a night like this. The two of you sitting together on that bench first time in 2 days. I've seen either one of you look like you weren't bracing for a blow. That's worth noticing. Man my age. That's about the only kind of thing left worth noticing. Neither Emmett nor Odessa answered that directly, but neither of them argued it, either. And Abel seemed satisfied enough with the silence and what went back on his fire and didn't say anything more on the subject for the rest of that day. It was later that same day, the light already starting its early winter, fade toward another long dark, that Emmett tried to stand up on his own and nearly went down for real. He'd been sitting too long. His leg had stiffened past the point of comfort, and pride being what it was, he pushed himself up off the bench without reaching for the crutch first, thinking he could manage the few steps to the stove unassisted, thinking a man ought to be able to walk across a small room without needing help every single time. Because if he needed help for a thing that small, what did that make him? What did that make the rest of him? The wooden leg slid. Not far. A few inches on a patch of melted snow tracked in near the stove, but it was enough his balance, never fully trustworthy, even in good conditions, tipped hard, and for one long, humiliating half-second he was falling, arms out, nothing to catch himself on but air and the very real prospect of the floor. Odessa was closest. She didn't catch him. Her hand came up, he saw it, felt the air of it near his shoulder, and then it stopped, held back, deliberate, and instead she reached down, unhurried, and picked up the crutch that had clattered to the floorboards beside him and held it out, not to steady him, to give him. You can stand, she said, flat, certain. I know it. Emmett looked at the crutch, looked at her. Something in his chest that had been clenched tight since the moment the stampede took his leg, something that flared hot with humiliation every time a well-meaning stranger rushed to prop him up like a fence post, about to topple. That something eased, just slightly, at the sight of her simply waiting. He took the crutch, planted it, found his balance, stood, on his own, slower than he would have liked, and with more visible effort than a man wants strangers to witness, but on his own. And when he finally straightened all the way and looked at her, something had shifted in his face that hadn't been there before. He laughed, short, surprised out of him. The first real laugh he'd let out in longer than he could remember. What, Odessa said, is funny? Nothing, he said, still half-lawing. Everything. 4 years, and you're the first person who didn't grab me like I was made of eggshell. You're not eggshell, she said. You're a man with a bad leg and a good arm. Different thing entirely. Most people can't tell the difference. Most people, Odessa said, aren't paying close enough attention to notice there is one. She was paying attention. He understood that now, standing there on his own, 2-1 reel, 1 wood feet, looking at a woman who'd sat unbothered through a night of blizzard and a morning of hard truths, and had just handed him back a piece of his dignity without so much as touching him. He understood it, and something about the understanding settled low and warm in his chest, unfamiliar enough that he didn't have a name for it yet. He decided not to go looking for one. Not yet. Some things a man ruins by naming them too soon. He made it to the stove, stood there a moment longer than necessary, warming hands that didn't especially need warming, mostly just to prove to himself the leg would hold if he asked it to twice in a row. It held. Careful, Odessa said, from the bench, not looking up. Man gets too pleased with himself standing near a stove. He tends to forget. The floor's still wet. Was I looking pleased with myself? Like a rooster that just remembered he could crow. That's a very specific insult. I've got a lot of them stored up, she said. Comes from years of practice, not using them, on people who didn't deserve it. You're the first one in a while who's earned a discount. He laughed again, and this time it came easier, the way a second laugh always does, once the first one's cracked something open. A discount. That the best I get? Full price is considerably worse. I believe you. You should, she said. Ask Royal Sutter sometime how the full price feels. Man's had 2 days to think it over already, and he hasn't worked up the nerve to test it yet. I glanced toward the corner where Dutch and Royal sat, heads bent together, careful not to look anywhere near the bench. They've been quiet. Quiet's the smartest thing either one of them's done since I got here. He shifted his weight, tested the leg once more, and made his way back toward the bench slower this time. Not from difficulty, but because he found, oddly, that he wasn't in any hurry to sit back down and end the conversation. Even standing there with his leg, starting to complain again about the cold. Can I ask you something, he said, and you tell me if it's rude. You can ask. I reserve the right to call it rude after that valise of yours. Looks like it weighs as much as a grown calf. What in the world is in it? Odessa considered him for a moment, weighing he could see her weighing it. Whether the question deserved a real answer or a deflection. She settled, apparently, on somewhere in between. Clothes, she said. A few books. This notebook's predecessor, and the one before that, going back 6 years now. And a hammer. A hammer. A good one. Bought it myself, in a town I won't name, from a blacksmith who tried to charge me double on account of, and I quote him directly, a woman your size ought to pay more, seeing as you'll get twice the use out of it. Did you pay double? I paid what a hammer costs, Odessa said, and I told him if he tried that arithmetic on the next woman who walked through his door, I'd come back and show him exactly how much use I could get out of it. Emmett laughed outright this time, a full laugh, the kind that startled even him a little with how easily it came. Across the room, Abel cracked one eye open at the sound, smiled faintly, and closed it again, apparently satisfied that whatever was happening on that bench didn't require his interference. You carry a hammer, Emmett said, still grinning, in a valise, across the territory, in case a blacksmith needs a lesson in arithmetic. I carry a hammer, Odessa said, because a woman traveling alone learns quick that some doors don't open polite, and I'd rather have a tool in my hand than an empty one when that happens. The lesson in arithmetic's just a bonus when the occasion calls for it. Remind me never to shortchange you. You couldn't afford to, she said, even if you tried. Discount rate or not. The banter faded, eventually into a comfortable sort of quiet, the kind two people settle into once they've proven to each other, through jokes and small trades of truth, that the ground between them is solid enough to rest weight on. Emmett found himself watching the fire more than the window now, and found, too, that the letter in his coat pocket had gone quiet in his mind for the better part of an hour, crowded out by something considerably more pleasant to think about. He caught himself smiling at nothing in particular, stopped, frowned at himself briefly, the way a man does when he notices he's enjoying something he hadn't planned on enjoying. In a life he hadn't planned on continuing to enjoy much of anything, because that wasn't the plan. The plan had been simple. Get to the land, fix the fences, live quiet alone, unbothered, once he's decided the rest of the world has already made up its mind about him. Except here he was, on a bench, laughing about a hammer, which didn't fit the plan at all. He decided, for the moment, not to worry about that either. Filed it away next to the muttering in the corner and the shaky handwriting in his uncle's letter. One more thing to sort out later. One more thing to sort out later. Once the storm let up, once there was room in his head for anything beyond the next log on the fire and the next hour of this particular, unplanned, entirely welcome company. The trouble started the way trouble usually does. Small, almost polite at first. Dutch Pruitt and Royal Sutter had been in the depot since, before Emmett arrived, he hadn't paid them much mind the first night, too occupied with the storm and the bench, and the woman who'd made room for him on it. But by the second full day of being snowed in together, boredom had worn their manners thin, and boredom, in men like that, tends to curdle into cruelty the way milk curdles, left too long in the sun. It had been building all morning, if a person knew what to watch for. Dutch pacing the length of the depot like a penned animal. Royal cracking his knuckles, for no reason at all, over and over, a habit that seemed to soothe him the way some men are soothed by chewing tobacco or humming hymns. They'd run out of cards to play 2 hours before, run out of whiskey not long after that, and a man with nothing left to occupy his hands, Emmett had learned long ago on cattle drives full of restless cowhands, was a man who went looking for something else to do with them. He'd hoped, foolishly, that the something else wouldn't involve him. Or her. It did. Say, Dutch said, loud enough to carry across the small room, aimed vaguely in Emmett's direction, but pitched for the whole audience. That leg of yours. Wood, ain't it? I can hear it knock on the floor when you walk. Emmett didn't look up from the fire he was tending. It is. Bet that makes for slow going. Come a blizzard. Come a stampede. Whatever it is, man with one leg's gotta be a real handicap to a crew. Man with one leg turned a stampeding herd single-handed, Emmett said, still not looking up. But I don't imagine you'd know much about that kind of work. Royal laughed at that too loud, covering for the fact that the jab had landed somewhere it stung. Dutch's smile thinned. Careful cripple, he said. Man ought to watch his tongue when he's got no leg to run on, if things don't cross sideways. Funny, Emmett said. Never needed to run from a man who talks as much as you do. Figured I'd have plenty of warning. That one landed harder. Royal's laugh cut off short, and Dutch's jaw tightened, and, for a moment the room went quiet in a way that had a different texture to it than the quiet of the storm outside, sharper, more alert, the kind of quiet that precedes a thing rather than follows one. Dutch turned instead toward Odessa. And you, he said, you're a sight, ain't you? Never seen a woman built like a barn door before. Bet you eat for 3 men and still ain't full. Bet you talk for 3 men, Odessa said, not looking up from her notebook, and still ain't said anything worth hearing. Royal laughed again, genuinely this time, caught off guard by it, and Dutch's face went red in a way that promised the joking, such as it was, had run out. Funny, Dutch said. Real funny. I bet you get real used to people staring, big as you are. Bet the whole town back wherever you crawled out of used to line up just to look. Something in Odessa's shoulders went still. Not tense, exactly. Just still. The particular stillness of a person standing very close to a memory they'd rather not be standing near. Because he didn't know. Couldn't know. And yet the words had found the wound anyway. Blind luck or cruelty's own strange instinct for the softest place to press. Emmett saw it. And that was the thing that moved him, not the insult aimed at himself, which he'd absorbed 100 times over and built calluses against, but the insult aimed at her, landing on a wound he now knew the shape of, having heard her describe it herself not 6 hours before. He stood, steadier, this time crutch already in hand, and his other hand, without quite deciding, drifted toward the hilt of the old knife, sheathed at his hip, the one his father had carried before him, the one he'd carried through the stampede and out the other side of it. That's enough, he said, quiet, but not soft. Dutch's eyes flicked to the knife hand. That a threat, cripple? It's a request, Emmett said. I'm asking you polite. Once. And if I don't feel like being polite back, then you'll find out what a man with one leg and one good arm can still manage to do. Dutch laughed. Not a real laugh. The kind men manufacture to cover the fact that something in the other man's voice has landed harder than expected. Big talk from a fella who near fell on his face, not 2 hours ago. I got back up, Emmett said. That's more than most men manage after they've said what you just said to a lady in this room. Lady. Dutch, eyes cut toward Odessa, sneering now, the last of whatever restraint he'd been holding on to burning off like morning frost. That what we're calling her? Didn't know they made ladies that size. They make ladies, Odessa said. Still seated, still calm, though something had gone very cold and very still behind her eyes, in every size the good Lord decides on. Seems to me the only thing undersized in this room is your manners, and there's no dress in the territory big enough to hide that shortfall. Royal barked a laugh before he could stop himself, and this time it wasn't at Odessa's expense, it was at Dutch's, and Dutch knew it, and his face went a shade darker still. Careful, both of you, Dutch said low now, meaner for the quiet. Storm's got us all stuck here a good while yet. Be a shame if things went ugly before that train ever shows. Would be, Emmett agreed. For you. Odessa's hand came down over his, not gripping, not restraining, just resting there, light as a decision already made. She didn't look at him. She was looking at Dutch. He doesn't need to fight you, she said. And I'm not going to let him get hurt, proving a point neither of you needs proved. Oh, is that right, Royal said, Dan standing. Now, too, some fresh confidence. Against one or so. He thought, badly miscounting the arithmetic of the room. You gonna stop 'em, big girl. Gonna sit on us? He shoved Emmett. Not hard. Barely more than a nudge. The kind of shove meant to provoke, rather than injure. But Emmett's balance was never a sure thing on his best day, and the crutch skidded on the wet floorboards. And for the second time in 2 days, he felt the world tilt sideways beneath him. He didn't fall, because Odessa moved. One hand. That's all it took. She closed her fist around the front of Royal's collar, coat, shirt, and all, and lifted. Straight up. His boots left the floor by a full 6 inches, his arms flailing at nothing, his face going from smug to slack-jawed terror in the space of one held breath, and she held him there, not shaking him, not throwing him, just holding him, suspended, at a height that made very clear exactly how little effort it was costing her. Nobody in the room spoke. Nobody in the room breathed much. Abel had gone rigid by the stove. Nell had a hand pressed to her mouth. Thomas stood half out of his seat, unsure whether he was meant to intervene or simply witness, and settled wisely on the latter. Odessa set Royal down. Gentle, almost. His boots touched the floor, and his knees nearly buckled from the shock of it, more than any actual harm done. And she didn't hit him, didn't need to. She just looked at him, a long, level, unhurried look, the kind that says everything a fist could say and more. And Royal took one step back, then another, then bumped into the wall and stayed there. We're done here, she said to both of them. Final. Dutch opened his mouth, closed it again. Whatever he saw in her face or in Royal's decided the matter for him, and the two of them retreated to the far corner of the depot without another word, and stayed there, and did not speak again for the rest of that evening. In the silence that followed, Abel, who had watched the entire exchange without moving, hands folded, saying nothing, until now leaned toward Emmett and spoke low, just for him. She's not an ordinary woman, the old man said. No, Emmett agreed, watching Odessa settle back onto the bench beside him like nothing at all had happened, picking her notebook back up, finding her place in it, as though the last 2 minutes hadn't occurred. She is not. Nell Merrick let out a long breath she'd apparently been holding since Royal's boots first left the floor, and pressed her face briefly into her husband's shoulder, half loving, half shaken. Thomas patted her hair, his own hands not quite steady either, and said something too quiet for anyone else to catch, and Nell nodded against him. Ma'am, Thomas said, louder, addressing Odessa directly for the first time since introductions the night before. I don't believe I've ever seen anything like that in my life. Hope you never have to again, Odessa said, without looking up. No, ma'am, Thomas agreed. Me too. Emmett watched the whole room recalibrate around her the way a herd recalibrates around a lead steer after a storm. Everyone's position shifting slightly, everyone understanding, without needing to discuss it. exactly where the center of gravity now sat. He thought of his own reputation, the one that had followed him out of the Bramwell. Outfit, there goes the cripple. Careful. Don't let him slow down the work, and thought, not for the first time that day, how strange it was to sit beside a woman whose reputation, wherever she went, seemed to arrive a half step ahead of her and clear the whole room out of respect instead of pity. He wondered briefly, uncharitably, whether he envied that, decided he didn't. Decided what he felt instead was something closer to relief, the particular relief of sitting next to a person strong enough that a man didn't have to spend his whole reserve of energy protecting her, and could, for once, simply exist beside her instead. The rest of that evening passed quieter than any before it. Something in the room had shifted, the way a room shifts after a storm inside it. Finally breaks not peace exactly, but a kind of settling, the dust allowed to fall back down to where it belonged. Odessa didn't speak of what she'd done, and Emmett didn't ask her to. He understood without being told that some acts don't need discussing afterward. They simply become part of what a person knows about another person, filed away quiet and permanent, the way you remember which way a river runs once you've crossed it. You could have let him fall, Emmett said eventually, low, meaning himself, meaning the moment before, meaning Royal's shove and his own bad balance. Would have been easier. Wouldn't have had to lift a man off his feet in front of a room full of strangers. I don't do things because they're easy, Odessa said. No, he said. I'm starting to gather that. She almost smiled again. That same fraction of a door easing open. You're a slow learner, Emmett Cordell. 4 years of people rushing to catch me, he said, and one day of you not rushing at all. Give a man some time to recalibrate. Take all the time you need, she said. I'm not going anywhere. Storms got me as trapped as you. It was meant lightly. He heard it that way, mostly. But underneath the lightness, there was something else, something neither of them named yet, a small and fragile thing, Carly. Neither of them wanted to spook by looking at it too directly, like a bird that had landed close enough to touch, if a person was foolish enough to reach. Neither of them reached. Not yet. Supper that evening was a thin affair, the last of the hardtack, divided into portions too small to satisfy anyone, and a pot of coffee stretched so far past its strength it barely deserved the name. But something about the meal felt different than the ones before it. Warmer. Not the food, the company around it. Abel offered up half his portion to the Merricks without being asked, waving off Nell's protest with a tired hand. Man my age don't need much fuel, he said. You two are young. Growing bodies still. Near enough. We're not children. Mr. Whitcomb, Thomas said, half lawing. No, Abel agreed. But you're newly married, and newly married folks need their strength for arguing about whose family to visit next Christmas. Take the bread. Nell laughed at that, a real laugh, the first Emmett had heard from her since the storm began, and even Thomas cracked a smile despite himself. Odessa, beside Emmett, allowed the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth, watching the exchange the way a person watches a fire finally catch after a long, frustrating effort at kindling. Even Dutch and Royal, from their corner, said nothing unkind. Whether from shame or simple exhaustion, Emmett couldn't say, and didn't much care to guess. Royal, at one point, even passed a tin cup of coffee toward the group without comment, and Thomas took it with a nod. And that was the whole of the peace treaty between them. No words, no apology, just a cup of bad coffee changing hands, in a room too cold and too crowded for grudges to survive much longer. Funny thing about a storm, A.B. said, into the quiet that followed. Strips everything down to what a person actually is. No house to hide in. No town watching to keep a man polite for show. Just this room, and whoever we turn out to be inside it. And who have we turned out to be? Odessa asked, not mocking. Genuinely curious, it seemed, what an old man made of the last 2 days. Abel considered the question with the seriousness it seemed to deserve. Better than I expected, he said finally. Worse than we could have been. Easy enough, if a couple of you hadn't stood up when it mattered. A glance brief, toward Emmett and Odessa both. I've been in rooms during hard weather before, folks. Seen it turn ugly quick when men get hungry and scared and looking for someone smaller to take it out on. This time it didn't. That's worth remembering, I think, longer than the storm itself will be. Nobody argued with him. Even Dutch, in his corner, kept his eyes on his coffee and said nothing. Emmett thought about that, later, lying along the bench with the fire burned low and Odessa's steady breathing beside him. A room full of strangers, trapped by weather none of them had chosen. All of them scraped down to whatever they actually were underneath, and the grudges and the old wounds each of them carried in from the cold. And what they'd turned out to be, in the end, wasn't so bad. An old man willing to give up his bread. A young couple learning, maybe, what a marriage was actually built to withstand. Two hard men, humbled enough by a woman's bare hand to remember their manners, at least for one night. And a woman and a man, both of them carrying pieces the world had told them were missing, who'd somehow made more room for each other on a narrow wooden bench than either of them had been offered anywhere else in years. It wasn't much of a philosophy, but it was something to fall asleep on, and Emmett found, for once, that it was enough. It was near dusk, the light gone the particular blue-gray of a Montana winter evening, when Dutch Pruitt finally worked up the nerve to speak again, not to Odessa this time, and not with any of his earlier swagger, but almost sideways, to Emmett, like a man trying to make amends by way of conversation instead of apology. "You said Bramwell," Dutch said, earlier. Something about turning a herd for the Bramwell outfit. Emmett looked up, wary. "That's right. Silas Bramwell, you know him?" Dutch's jaw worked for a moment before the words came. "Rode fence for him 2 summers back. Big outfit north of here. Up past the Cordell land he stopped." Something crossed his face, some calculation clicking into place. "Cordell, that's your name, ain't it? Man at the ticket counter said it when he was checking your fare, first night before the storm shut the office down." Emmett went very still. "That's right," he said carefully. "My uncle's land, left it to me this past fall." "Your uncle," Dutch said slowly, "was Walton Cordell. He was." Dutch let out a short, humorless breath, almost a laugh, and shook his head, like a man who just watched 2 pieces of a puzzle slide together, without meaning, to look for the picture. "Small world, Mr. Cordell. Real small world. Bramwell's outfit runs cattle right up against the Cordell boundary line. Has for years. There was some kind of trouble out there before your uncle passed. Trouble over the water rights creek runs through both properties, and Bramwell's never much cared for sharing what he figures ought to be his." "What kind of trouble?" Emmett asked, his voice gone flat and careful, the way it went when he was bracing for something, before he knew exactly what shape it would take. Dutch's eyes flicked toward Royal, some silent and unspoken thing passing between them, the kind of look shared by men who know more than they're willing to hand over for free. "Ain't my business to say," he muttered. "Ask around when you get out there. Folks'll tell you plenty, if you're willing to hear it. All I know is your uncle wasn't an old man when he died. Wasn't sickly, neither. Not that anybody ever heard tell of. Man was fit as a fiddle at Sunday service, not 2 weeks before word came down he'd passed." He said nothing further, turned back to Royal, and the two of them lapsed into a silence that had the texture of men who'd already said more than they'd meant to. Emmett sat with that unfinished sentence, like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples of it, spreading out slow and cold through everything he'd thought he understood about the quiet, empty inheritance waiting for him at the end of this storm. His uncle's land, bordering Bramwell's, fit as a fiddle 2 weeks before he died. The same Bramwell who'd once thanked him kindly for saving 3,000 head of cattle and then let him go 2 weeks later because a broken man wasn't worth the wage. Small world indeed. Small and getting smaller, and none of what was shrinking into view looked friendly. Beside him, Odessa had gone quiet too, her notebook closed now, her eyes on him instead of the page. She didn't ask what was wrong. She'd learned enough about him in 2 days to know that pressing wouldn't get her there any faster than waiting would. Outside, at last, the wind began just slightly to soften. the storm easing its grip by degrees, the way all storms eventually do, though nobody in that little depot yet understood that the true storm, the one waiting for them out past the snowdrifts and the frozen fence lines, had only just announced itself. Emmett looked toward the frosted window, toward the dark and the white and whatever lay beyond it, 40 miles northwest, sagging under snow, older than he was, waiting on him the way it had waited on nobody for years. A house, a fence line, a dead man who'd been fit as a fiddle 2 weeks before he wasn't anymore. "Everything all right?" Odessa asked, finally, quiet enough that only he could hear it. "I don't know yet," Emmett said. "Honest. I think I'm about to find out." She didn't press further. She simply shifted, an inch, closing the small distance between them on the bench, not much, the smallest gesture, but deliberate, and let her shoulder rest, briefly, against his. "Whatever it is," she said, "you won't be finding it out alone. Not unless you mean to leave me sitting on this bench when the train finally comes." He looked at her. Really. Looked, the way a man looks at something he's just realized he doesn't want to lose sight of. "I don't mean to," he said. Night came down over Widow's Bend for the second time, and the wind, though weaker than before, still had enough voice left in it to rattle the windows and keep sleep somewhere just out of reach. Emmett lay along the bench, the blanket pulled up to his chest, staring at the crooked lantern, flame guttering low on its last inch of oil, and found his mind circling back the way minds do unhelpfully, at the exact moment a man most wants quiet to the letter folded in his coat. "In the event of my passing." His uncle's hand had been shaky by the time he wrote it, the letters leaning hard to the right like a fence about to give way in a strong wind. Emmett had read that shakiness as age. Simple age. A man's hand failing him, same as everything else fails a man eventually. Now he wasn't sure. Fit as a fiddle 2 weeks before he died. That's what Dutch had said. And a man fit as a fiddle didn't usually write his last letter with a hand shaking that bad, unless something other than age was doing the shaking. "You're thinking loud," Odessa said, from her place against the wall, eyes still closed. "I can hear it from here. Didn't know thinking made noise. Yours does. Whole bench near vibrates with it." He almost laughed. Almost. "Just turning something over." What that man said. "About my uncle. You want my thought on it?" "Wouldn't mind it." She opened her eyes, considered the ceiling for a moment before she spoke, the way she seemed to consider most things before she let them out into the world. "My thought is, you won't get the truth of it sitting on a bench in Widow's Bend. You'll get it standing on that land, asking the people who were there. Speculating in the dark just wears a man out for nothing. Better to save the worry for when you've got something solid to worry about. That's a hard kind of comfort. I don't have the soft kind in stock," she said. "Never needed to keep any. Nobody around me was ever offering it back." He turned that over too. Thought about the wedding stage, the posters, the ticket money split 3 ways like a fair and equal arrangement. Thought about a father who'd have to look his daughter in the eye every day after doing what he did to her, and somehow found a way to keep doing it anyway. "For what it's worth," Emmett said, "I mean to offer some. The soft kind. Whenever you'll take it." Odessa didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had gone quieter than he'd heard it yet, quieter even than the wind outside. "I'll let you know," she said, "when I'm ready to take it." "That's fair. It's more than fair. It's generous, coming from me. Most men don't get offered a maybe. They get a door shut in their face and told to be grateful they got that much warning. I'm not most men." "No," she said, and this time there was something almost warm underneath the flatness of it. "I'm starting to gather that." The lantern guttered once more and went out, oil finally spent, and rooms settled into the deep blue dark of a winter night with only the stove's low coals left to mark the difference between the room and the world outside it. Abel's breathing had gone slow and even. The Merricks had long since stopped whispering. In the far corner, Dutch and Royal lay as far from everyone else as the small room allowed, saying nothing, their earlier bravado gone somewhere quiet to lick its wounds. Emmett listened to Odessa's breathing beside him, steady, unhurried, the the breathing of a woman who had decided, tonight at least, that the bench beneath her was safe enough to rest in fully. He thought about the word she'd used that first night. Now, it is now. Small word, doing a great deal of work. A seat that hadn't been his an hour before, offered the moment it mattered. And he wondered, drifting finally toward sleep himself, how many other things in his life might turn out the same way, not owed to him, not promised to him, but they're all the same, the instant he was brave enough to ask. Outside, the storm kept working, softer now, but far from finished. And somewhere north of them, past the white and the dark, a fence line waited, and a dead uncle's unanswered questions waited with it that neither Emmett nor Odessa yet understood would test everything they were about to become to each other. Before sleep finally took him, Emmett found one more thought, waiting, quiet and unbidden, the way the truest thoughts always seem to arrive, not chased down, just handed over, once a man's guard has worn thin enough to let them through. He thought of the bench in the church hall his father used to sit him on as a boy, waiting through Sunday sermons too long for a restless child, and how his father would lean down every so often and say, low enough that only Emmett could hear it, hold still, son, this seat's yours as long as you need it. Small words. He hadn't thought of them in 20 years. Hadn't needed to, maybe, until a woman on a different bench, in a different storm, had said something close enough to the same thing to shake the memory loose. It is now. 3 words, and somehow they'd done what 4 years of doctors and preachers and well-meaning strangers had failed to do. They'd made him feel, for the length of one storm-bound night, less like a man missing a piece of himself and more like a man simply waiting his turn to be whole again. He didn't know yet what waited for him on his uncle's land, didn't know about the water rights, or the shaking handwriting, or the debt an old man's death might still be owed, didn't know how far Silas Bramwell's ambitions stretched, or what a woman with a hammer in her valise and a ledger of old wrongs in her coat pocket might yet be called on to do about it. All he knew, drifting finally toward sleep with the stove's last coals ticking softly in the dark, was that for the first time in 4 years he wasn't dreading the morning. That would have to be enough for tonight. Outside, the wind eased another degree, and another, working its way toward silence the way all Montana storms eventually do, not with apology, and not all at once, but slowly, grudgingly, like something large, finally admitting it had spent itself. By the time the gray dawn came creeping back into the frosted windows of Widow's Bend, the world outside lay still and white and enormous, scoured clean, waiting to be walked out into. Neither Emmett nor Odessa woke to see it right away, and for once in a life that had taught them both to keep one eye open at all times, that was all right. The bench had held. The night had passed. By nightfall, the train would come, and neither of them would be quite the same person stepping off it as they'd been stepping on. But that was tomorrow's business. Tonight, somewhere north of them, 40 long miles past the last of the drifts, a fence line and a dead man's unfinished business, sat waiting in the snow patient, silent and entirely unaware that the two people about to come, looking for answers, were no longer quite as alone as the storm had found them. The train came at dusk, exactly as Odessa said it would. No fanfare, no apology from the sky for 2 days stolen. Just a long, low whistle cutting through air gone finally still, and a black engine crawling out of the white like something that had survived a war it wasn't supposed to survive. Everybody boarded quiet, because there wasn't much left to say after 2 days trapped together that hadn't already been said, out loud or otherwise. Abel shook Emmett's hand at the platform, held it a beat longer than a handshake usually holds. Nell hugged Odessa without asking permission first, which was its own kind of miracle, and Odessa let her. Dutch and Royal didn't say goodbye at all, which suited everybody fine. Emmett and Odessa rode the same car, didn't discuss it, just ended up there, the way water ends up in the lowest part of a valley not chosen, exactly, inevitable. Last stop's Larkspur Junction, Odessa said, watching snow-buried fence posts blur past the window. That's as close as the rail gets to your uncle's land? 6 miles out from there. Wagon or walking the rest? You've got a wagon? I've got to hope there's a wagon, Emmett said. Man doesn't leave a letter about his fences and forget to mention there's no way left to reach them. She almost smiled. He was starting to catalog those almost smiles, the way another man might catalog silver. Rare. Worth noticing when they showed up. You're quiet, she said after a while, when the fence posts had given way to open white and nothing else. Quieter than the bench. Thinking. About the letter. About the letter. About the leg. About whether a man with one working knee has any business trying to run cattle on land. He hasn't even seen the far corners of yet. He shook his head, once, at himself. Foolish thoughts. Doesn't stop them coming. Foolish thoughts come to everybody, Odessa said. Difference is whether you let them drive the wagon or just ride along in the back complaining. That a fact you learned somewhere particular? That's a fact I learned on a stage. In a church hall in Ohio, she said, where every foolish thought I'd ever had about myself sat up front and drove for a good long while, before I finally shoved them in the back and took the reins myself. He looked at her. She kept her eyes on the window, but something in her jaw had gone tight, the old wound flickering close to the surface, even here, even now, 100 miles removed from the hall it had happened in. Took you how long, Emmett asked, to shove them back? Still shoving, she admitted. Some days it takes more arm than others. Well, he said, you've got the arm for it, if nothing else. That earned him a real laugh, this time short, surprised, gone as quick as it came, but real. And Emmett found himself thinking, watching the snow blur past outside, that he'd rather earn one of those laughs out of her than a whole hand of cards dealt his way. There was a wagon. Barely. One wheel wanted replacing. The bed had a crack running clean through it that Emmett found with his boot heel, before he found it with his eyes. But it rolled, and a mule at the Junction livery agreed, for a fair price, to be rented instead of purchased outright, and that was enough to get 2 travelers and one diminished collection of belongings. The last 6 miles home. He tried the word out in his head a few times along the ride, testing its weight the way he might test ice on a pond. Didn't hold yet. Not fully. But it didn't crack under him either, which felt like progress. Odessa didn't offer to drive, didn't need to ask whether he could manage a wagon with one good leg. She'd watched him bank a stove and stand himself back up off a wet floor, and some questions by now answered themselves. She rode beside him instead, valise between her boots, notebook tucked against her ribs like something that mattered more than the cold did. Because the land, when it finally came into view past a rise thick with snow-bent pine, didn't look like an inheritance. It looked like a wound. The house sagged on its foundation the way an old man sags, in a chair he's sat in too many years running. One shutter gone entirely, torn off by some winter wind years back and never replaced. The porch step had rotted through in the middle, a black gap like a missing tooth, and the fence, what remained of it, lay half buried in drifts. Rails scattered, posts leaning at angles no fence post should ever lean. Emmett sat in the wagon a long moment before climbing down. Not what I pictured, he admitted. What did you picture? Something a man could be proud of inheriting. Odessa looked at the house, at the fence, at the whole slumped, forgotten shape of it under 6 inches of unbroken snow. You're not inheriting the house, she said. You're inheriting the chance to fix it. Different thing. Better thing. If you ask people who've never had either. He climbed down, crutch first, into snow that came near his knee, and made his way toward the porch step that wasn't going to hold his weight, no matter how careful he was about it. It didn't hold his weight. He went through to his shin, wood snapping under him with a crack loud enough to send a startled jay screaming out of the nearest pine, and for one long, humiliating second, he was stuck there. One leg wood and one leg wedged through rotten boards, looking every bit the broken man the Bramwell foreman had once quietly assumed he was. Odessa didn't laugh. She waded through the snow, reached down, and pulled him free with one hand, not gentle, not rough, just efficient, the way she seemed to handle most obstacles life put in front of her. "Welcome home," she said. "Some welcome. House has opinions about visitors, apparently." Might warm up to you in time. Inside was worse, and somehow also better. Worse because dust lay thick over everything. Because a family of mice had clearly cleaned the pantry as their own territory some seasons back. Because the roof had a leak directly over what had once been a bed. The water stains spread wide and dark across the floorboards, like a map of somewhere nobody wanted to travel. Better because there was a fireplace. Because there was a table, sturdy despite everything, 4 chairs around it, like it was still waiting on a faithful family that sat at there in years. Because there was, sitting square in the middle of that table, a small wooden box that hadn't been there by accident. Odessa moved through the rooms, first methodical, the way she seemed to do most things, testing floorboards with her boot heel before trusting her full weight to them, checking the fireplace flue for blockage, running a finger along the windowsills to gauge how much winter had gotten in through the gaps. Emmett watched her work and found himself, not for the first time, grateful in a way that went beyond simple manners, grateful for a person who moved through a broken house like it was a puzzle worth solving instead of a burden worth resenting. Roof will hold another night, she reported, back in the main room, barely. We'll want to patch it proper before the next snow, or that stain over the bed's going to have company. You know roofing? I know most things that keep a body from freezing to death, she said. Learned young. Wasn't given much choice about it, growing up in a house where nobody much cared if the giant girl caught cold. She said it plain, the way she said most things about her past, no bid for pity in it, just fact laid down flat. But Emmett heard, underneath the flatness, the particular ache of a childhood spent learning self-sufficiency, not because it was admirable, but because nobody else had ever bothered to offer any other kind of care. Well, he said, you'll have help patching it this time, for whatever that's worth. Worth something, she said. First time in a long while anybody's offered to hold the other end of the ladder. Emmett crossed to the table, opened the box. Inside, a stack of papers, tied with twine, gone brittle with age. A pocket watch, stopped, and a second letter, sealed. His name written across the front in the same shaky hand as the first. His stomach went tight before he'd read a single word, because a man doesn't leave 2 letters unless he suspects the first one might not be enough. Doesn't seal a second one unless there's something in it he wasn't ready to say, plain, out loud, the first time around. Read it, Odessa said, quiet, from somewhere behind him. Whatever it says. Better you know it now than carry the not knowing around all winter. He broke the seal. Emmett, if you're reading this, I expect Doc Weaver's already told you. I passed peaceful in my sleep. That's the story I asked him to tell, and I'm sorry to have made a good man lie for me, but there was reason in it. The truth is, Silas Bramwell and I have fought over Larkin Creek for the better part of 3 years. That creek runs the whole length of my south pasture before it crosses onto his land, and near 2 years back, he dammed a stretch of it upstream, on his own property, legal enough on paper, except the dam starves my herd's water near dry every summer. Since, I fought him on it, filed with the Territorial Land Office. Was making headway, too. These past few weeks, a surveyor was set to come out any day now and settle the boundary, and water rights both, official, in writing, where Bramwell couldn't argue it away with his lawyers and his money. 3 nights before that surveyor was due, I took sick sudden and hard, worse than any sickness I've known in 71 years of living. Doc Weaver couldn't name it, said my heart just gave out. Maybe, though he admitted himself it looked strange for a heart complaint. I don't know what happened to me, Emmett, and I won't put a name to something I can't prove. But I'll say this plain, a man doesn't get that sick that fast. For no reason. 3 days shy of a surveyor arriving that Bramwell stood to lose a great deal over. I'm asking you, if you're willing, to see it through. The surveyor's report should still be filed somewhere in the land office at Larkascoo at Larkspur Junction, paid for and waiting on completion. Finish what I started. Don't let a damned creek and a rich man's greed be the last word on this land. And Emmett, don't come here angry. Come here careful. Whatever happened to me, Bramwell's men outnumber whatever you can bring against them. Use your head before your fists. You were always better with your head than you gave yourself credit for. Your uncle, with more love than I ever said out loud. While I had the chance, Walton Emmett read it twice. The second time slower, like reading it faster, might make the words less true. He thinks he was poisoned, Odessa said, reading over his shoulder without apology, because some moments don't call for asking permission. He doesn't say poisoned. He doesn't have to. A man doesn't write 3 paragraphs circling a word that careful unless he's afraid of what happens if he says it plain and he's wrong. Or, worse if he's right, and somebody finds the letter before you do. Emmett set the pages down. His hands, he noticed, had gone unsteady in a way the cold outside hadn't managed. "Come here careful," he said, half to himself. "Man spends his whole life teaching me patience, and his last words are still teaching it. Good advice doesn't stop being good advice just because it comes from a dying man," Odessa said. Especially then. Outside, wind pushed against the broken shutter, a low groan that sounded, in that moment, uncomfortably close to a warning. They spent the better part of that first afternoon simply existing inside the shock of it, the letter's careful, terrible restraint, the unspoken words sitting in every sentence like a stone dropped in still water. Emmett read it a third time, alone, while Odessa busied herself hauling in wood from what remained of the woodshed, giving him the privacy grief sometimes needs even when the person offering it would rather stay close. When she came back in, arms full, snow melting in her hair, she found him standing at the window, looking out at the ruined fence line, like it might answer the questions the letter had only half asked. "You went quiet," she said. "Trying to picture him," Emmett admitted. "Writing that, knowing, maybe, it'd be near the last thing he ever put to paper. Man, spent his whole life not saying much of anything to me, and here he is, dying, choosing his words careful enough to accuse a rich man of murder without quite accusing him, so as not to put me in danger chasing down a claim he couldn't prove. Sounds like a man who loved you more than he ever knew how to say out loud while he had breath enough to say it easy. That's what gets me," Emmett said. "All those years. Could have said it any Sunday. Chose instead to save it, for a letter he hoped I'd never have cause to read. Some men are built that way," Odessa said, setting the wood down by the hearth. "Save the truest things for last, like they're afraid saying them too early spends them out. My grandmother was the same. Told me she loved me exactly twice in my whole life. Once when I was born, so she claimed, and once the week before she died. I used to be angry about that. The waiting. Now I mostly think she just didn't trust herself not to cry saying it any sooner, and pride wouldn't allow the crying." Emmett turned that over, the way he turned over most things she offered him, slow, careful, giving it the weight it deserved. Pride's a strange thing to inherit, from people who never say the softer parts out loud, isn't it? She said. Strange and heavy, and near impossible to set down, once you've been carrying it long enough. But you don't have to hand it down further, if you don't want to. Whatever kind of man you turn out to be, with the years you've got left, that part's still yours to choose. He didn't have an answer for that. Just let it sit there, warm, in a house still too cold to properly hold warmth yet, and found that it helped anyway. They didn't have long to sit with the letter before trouble introduced itself in person. It came on horseback, 3 riders, cresting the rise where the fence used to stand proud, moving unhurried, the particular unhurried of men who know they have all the time and all the leverage in the world. Emmett watched them come from the broken porch, crutch under one arm, the second letter still folded in his coat at where it had gone the moment he'd finished reading it twice. The lead writer was heavy-set, gray at the temples, dressed better than the weather, a queer kind of man who dressed well specifically, so other men would notice the difference between his coat and theirs. Silas Bramwell, Emmett said, quiet, before the man had even spoken. Some faces a man doesn't forget, even 4 years and 1 leg later. Bramwell reined up at what remained of the fence line and looked at the house, the porch, the broken shutter, with an expression that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite satisfaction, but sat close enough to both that Emmett's jaw tightened on sight of it. "Emmett Cordell," Bramwell said. Didn't expect Walton's nephew to be a man I'd already met. Didn't expect to be met by the man who fired me 2 weeks after I saved his herd, Emmett said. Small world, Mr. Bramwell. Business is business, Bramwell said. Easy, like the words cost him nothing, because they never had. I was sorry to hear about your leg. Sorrier still to hear about your uncle. Fine man, Walton. Stubborn as a mule about that creek, God rest him, but fine all the same. Funny thing to call a man stubborn, Emmett said, over water that was rightfully his to use. Something flickered behind Bramwell's eyes, brief, controlled, gone before it could be called anything as plain as guilt. Rightfully's a word for lawyers to argue over, he said. I've come with a fair offer, is all. Save you the trouble of fighting a battle your uncle already lost. I'll buy this land off you, house and pasture both, at a price generous enough a man in your condition. Wouldn't have to work another day he didn't want to. A man in my condition. No offense, meant. Plenty taken anyway, Emmett said. I'll manage the land my uncle left me, Mr. Bramwell. Same as any man, with 2 good legs would. Bramwell's gaze drifted, deliberate, toward the crutch, toward the broken porch step behind Emmett, toward everything about the scene that seemed, to a man like Bramwell, to argue against Emmett's own claim. Word travels fast in this territory, Bramwell said. Folks'll hear soon enough there's a cripple trying to hold land he can't even walk across without falling through his own porch. Won't take long before nobody wants to sell you feed, or lend you a hand come branding season, or extend you credit at the mercantile. Pride's a fine thing, Mr. Cordell. Doesn't keep cattle alive through a hard winter, though. Odessa stepped out onto the porch behind Emmett, just stepped out. Didn't say a word yet. Didn't need to Bramwell's second in command. A lean rider with a scar through one eyebrow actually pulled his horse back a full step at the sight of her. And who's this, Bramwell said, recovering his composure, a half-beat too slow to hide that it had slipped at all. Odessa Calloway, she said. The hand who's staying on to help Mr. Cordell manage land he can walk across just fine porch steps notwithstanding. A woman, Odessa agreed, who's already lifted a grown man off his feet with one hand this week for saying less insulting things than you've managed in the last 2 minutes. Bramwell's jaw worked. The scarred rider beside him said something too low to catch, and Bramwell's face darkened further, whatever amusement he'd been holding on to, finally souring all the way through. Think on the offer, Mr. Cordell, he said, gathering his reins. It won't stay generous forever. Land like this has a way of losing value fast. Once word gets around what kind of trouble comes with owning it. He turned his horse. The 3 riders retreated the way they'd come, unhurried still, and Emmett watched them go with his jaw tight enough to ache and his uncle's letter sitting, heavy in his coat pocket like a stone. He now understood. He'd have to carry the whole way through whatever was coming. Trouble comes with owning it, Emmett repeated. Once the riders were small against the white distance. He just told us plain as day. Didn't even mean to, maybe. Man like that always tells you plain, eventually, Odessa said. Pride makes them careless. He just handed you a confession dressed up as a threat. You think he did it, poisoned him, or had it done? I think, Odessa said, careful, that a man doesn't offer to buy grief-stricken land at a generous price out of the goodness of his heart. I think a man who damned a creek to starve out his neighbor's herd isn't above worse if worse serves him better. But thinking it and proving it are 2 different fences, Emmett, and you'll want the second one built solid, or you go accusing a man with 3 riders and a lawyer's retainer of murder. My uncle said the same. Near enough. Your uncle sounds like he was smarter than most men get credit for, dying scared and still thinking 3 steps ahead. Emmett looked toward the horizon where Bramwell's riders had finally vanished, swallowed by distance and glare. Surveyor. That's the word he kept circling back to. Report sitting in the land office at Larkspur Junction paid for, unfinished. If I can get a surveyor back out here, finish what he started. Then you've got the boundary and the water rights settled in writing, same as he wanted, Odessa, finished. And Bramwell's dam becomes somebody else's problem to defend in a courtroom instead of a fence line. You make it sound simple. It isn't simple. It's just clear. different things entirely. She looked at him, steady, the same look she'd given him from the bench that first night. Simple would be selling the land and living easy on Bramwell's guilt money. Clear is knowing exactly what you're fighting for and why, even when the fighting's hard. I'd rather stand beside a man doing the clear thing than the simple one. If you're asking which I'd choose. Wasn't asking, Emmett said. But I'm glad to hear it anyway. They spent the next 2 days making the house survivable before anything else, because a letter accusing a rich man of murder wasn't going to matter much if the roof came down on them first, and because grief, Emmett was learning, went down easier alongside honest labor than it did sitting still with nothing but a fireplace and a dead man's handwriting for company. Odessa split wood like she'd been born to it, and maybe, in some sense, she had a body built strong as hers had to find some use for the strength, and she seemed almost grateful for the chance to spend it on something as simple and honest as firewood instead of on lifting grown men off their feet. Emmett patched the porch step with lumber salvaged from a collapsed section of barn, working slow, working careful, and found to his own quiet surprise that his hands still knew exactly the business his father had once promised him they would. The roof took the better part of a full day between them, Odessa, up top with hammer and nails, calling down measurements, and Emmett below, steadying the ladder with his good leg braced and his crutch hooked over one arm, passing up shingles salvaged from the same collapsed barn. You're slow, she called down, around mid-morning, not unkindly. I've got one leg doing the work of two, Emmett called back. Give a man some credit. I'll give you credit when the shingles arrive faster than I can nail the last one down. Man could get a complex, working for a woman who never runs out of complaints. Man could also learn to climb faster, Odessa said, and something in her voice, even from up on the roof, carried enough warmth that Emmett found himself grinning up at her despite the insult, or maybe because of it. By mid-afternoon, the worst of the leak was patched, and Odessa climbed down slow, careful of her own weight on a ladder never built for a woman her size, and stood beside him surveying the work with something like satisfaction. Not bad, she said, for a cripple and a giant, working with half a barn's worth of scrap lumber. High praise. I'm still faster than you. Wasn't a race. Everything's a race, Odessa said, when you've spent your whole life being told you'd lose it before you even started running. He looked at her sideways at that, catching the truth underneath the joke, the way he was learning to do. More and more with her every piece of banter carrying some older, heavier thing folded inside it, if a person knew to look. You're not losing anything, he said. Not with me watching. She didn't have a quick answer for that one. Just looked at him a moment, longer than the conversation strictly required, and then turned back toward the house, calling over her shoulder that the fence posts weren't going to reset themselves. It was on the second evening, fire finally holding steady, roof finally patched enough to truss through a night's snow, that a fourth rider appeared on the rise. Alone. No hurry to him at all, though something in the set of his shoulders read different than Bramwell's, had less confidence, more dread. The posture of a man riding toward a conversation he'd rather not be having. Odessa went still at the window. That's Elias, she said. Flat. Careful. The particular careful of a voice trying hard not to let anything else leak out around the edges of it. Elias. My brother. He didn't come armed, at least. Didn't come with Bramwell's swagger or Dutch and Royal's cruelty. He came down off his horse, slow, hat in hand before his boots even touched snow, and stood at the edge of the yard like a man waiting to be told whether he was welcome before he risked finding out the hard way. Des, he said. Just that. Her name? Worn soft at the edges, the way a name gets worn when it's been said wild love 1,000 times before it was ever said with anything else. Elias. She didn't move from the doorway. You've got some nerve riding all this way. I've got more than nerve. I've got 2 years of regret riding with me, if that counts for anything. It doesn't. Not yet. Emmett stood back, giving the two of them what space the small yard allowed, though he stayed close enough that Odessa would know, without having to check, that he hadn't gone anywhere. I didn't know. Elias said. About the ticket money. Not the full amount. Pa told me it was $50, split 3 ways for expenses. I found out after you'd already gone that it was near 400, that he'd been planning the whole thing for months, selling tickets before he'd even sent word to Corliss Vane about marrying you. And that changes what exactly? Whether you cashed the check or not, you stood in that hall and watched it happen. Didn't say a word. I know it. You laughed, Elias. The word landed hard enough that even the horse shifted, unsettled by the sound of it. Elias's face went pale, then red, the shame of it visibly working through him in real time. I was scared, he said, of Pa. Of looking soft in front of the whole town. I've spent 2 years hating myself for it, Des, and no amount of hating myself has managed to second of that night, so I know saying, sorry now is worth exactly nothing to you. But I'm saying it anyway, because the alternative is saying nothing, and I've done that once already, and I'll be damned if I do it twice. Odessa said nothing for a long moment. Emmett watched something complicated move behind her eyes, not forgiveness, not yet, but not the flat, unbothered wall she usually kept up either. Why are you really here? She said finally. 2 years of silence. And now a 6-day ride in January. That's not an apology. That's an errand. Elias's jaw tightened. Pa's dying. Des. Doctor gives him through spring, maybe less. He's asked for you. Every week since the diagnosis. Won't say why. Just says your name and goes quiet after. And you rode all this way to deliver a dying man's request. I rode all this way, Elias said, because whatever he wants to say to you, I think you deserve to hear it, or refuse to hear it, on your own terms instead of finding out secondhand after it's too late to choose either way. Convenient, Odessa said, that his conscience found him only once. His body started failing. Where was this concern 2 years ago? Where was it the morning after, when I packed a bag with what I could carry and walked out of that house alone? And not one soul in that family came after me to see whether I'd frozen in a ditch somewhere before I made the next town. Elias flinched at that, visibly, the accusation landing exactly where she'd aimed it. I don't have an answer that makes that better, he said. I've turned it over 100 nights since, trying to find one, and there isn't one. I was a coward, Des. Pa's coward, same as I'd always been. Watching you get sold off that stage didn't change that about me. It just made the cowardice harder to live inside of afterward. Harder for you, Odessa said. Imagine that. I'm not asking you to imagine my side of it as equal to yours. It isn't. It never will be. I just stopped. Started again quieter. I used to watch you at supper, growing up. Watched you fold yourself smaller every year. Shoulders in, voice down, like you were trying to disappear. A little more each season, so the rest of us wouldn't have to look at how much space you took up. And I never once told you that you didn't need to do that. Never once said, Des, you don't have to make yourself small for us. I think about that more than the wedding, some nights. The years before it, when I could have said something simple and true, and didn't. Something shifted in Odessa's face, not softening exactly, but a crack forming somewhere in the wall she'd built, thin enough to let a little light through without letting the whole structure down. Why now, she asked again, quieter this time. Truly, not the errand, the real why. Because I don't want to bury him, Elias said, and realize after that, I let 2 brothers' worth of cowardice cost you the chance to hear whatever he needs to say, even if what he needs to say turns out to be worth nothing at all. I'd rather you get to refuse him to his face than never get the chance to refuse him at all. Odessa was quiet a long moment. Behind her, Emmett said nothing, offered nothing, understood without being told that this was not his conversation to steer, only to stand near enough for. I'm not going back to Ohio, she said finally. I'm not asking you to move back. Just to come. Hear him out. Then leave again, if that's what you decide. And if I say no, then I ride home and tell him no, Elias said. And I won't blame you for it. One single day of my life. But I had to ask, Des. Had to look you in the eye and ask proper, at least once, before it's too late for either of you to ask anything of each other again. She didn't answer him that night. Sent him to bed down in the barn instead. Blankets, and what little food the house could spare, and told him plain she needed time before she gave him anything resembling a decision. Later, by the fire she sat, with her notebook closed in her lap, staring at nothing, and Emmett sat beside her, the way he'd learned to close enough to matter, quiet enough not to crowd. "You don't have to go," he said. "I know that. You don't have to decide tonight, either. I know that, too." She let out a breath long and slow, the first real crack he'd seen in her composure since the depot. "Doesn't make it simple, knowing it. He sold tickets to watch me humiliated, Emmett. And some small, stupid part of me still wants to know why he's asking for me now, at the end of it. Wants to know bad enough that it scares me. That's not stupid. Feels stupid. Wanting to understand the people who hurt us isn't stupid," Emmett said. "It's just human. Doesn't mean you owe him forgiveness. Doesn't mean you owe him anything at all. But wanting the why, that's not weakness. That's just a person trying to make sense of a wound that never got explained to them properly." She looked at him for a long moment, firelight catching the exhaustion in her face, the old wound and the new decision, both sitting heavy on her at once. "What would you do?" she asked. "In my place, I'd stay," Emmett said. "Honest, because anything else would have cheapened the question. Not because your father's earned it. Because I don't think you'd forgive yourself 10 years from now for not at least hearing him out while you still had the chance. But that's my answer for my life, not yours. You're the only one who gets to decide what yours is worth spending on him. And if I stay here instead, refuse Elias. Stay and help you fight Bramwell for this land, letters, and damned creeks and all. Then I'd be glad of the company," he said. "Gladder than I know how to say properly. But I won't hold you here out of wanting you to stay, Dessa. That's not the kind of man I mean to be." "I know it isn't," she said. "That's part of why I'm still sitting here instead of already halfway to the barn to tell Elias I've changed my mind out of guilt." "Only part?" "The other part," she said, and here her voice went quieter than he'd heard it. Quieter even than that first night, on the bench, that the first time since I left that hall in Ohio. Somebody's asked me what I want, instead of telling me what I owe. You didn't tell me I owed you loyalty for a blanket and a bench. You didn't tell me I owed my father forgiveness for raising me. You just asked, plain, what I wanted. Nobody's done that in longer than I can measure." Emmett didn't answer right away. Some silences, he was learning, deserved to be left whole instead of filled. She was quiet a long moment, watching the fire, and when she finally spoke, her voice had steadied back into something closer to the flat, sure tone he'd first heard on that bench. 3 words that had changed the whole shape of his winter. "I'm staying," she said. "Not because I've stopped wanting to know why. Because there's a fight standing right in front of me, real and present, and a father's questions 2 years old can wait a little longer than a damned creek and a dead man's unfinished letter can. Elias can ride home and tell Pa I said no. For now. Not forever, just for now." Emmett didn't say anything right away. Just let the decision settle into the room, the way decisions do when they're finally fully made. Quiet, solid, taking up exactly the space they need and not an inch more. "For now," he agreed, "is enough." Elias left at first light before either of them was fully awake to see him off proper. He left a note instead, folded under a stone on the porch step. Emmett had spent an afternoon bearing 3 lines, nothing more, telling Odessa he understood, that he'd tell their father she was well, that he hoped whatever came of the fight ahead, she'd write to him even if she never wrote to Pa again. Odessa read it twice, the way Emmett had read his uncle's letter twice, and folded it away into the same notebook that held 2 years of tallied wrongs, as though it belonged there now too, not forgiveness exactly, but the first entry in a ledger that might, someday, if Elias kept proving himself worth the trouble, start balancing back towards something warmer. "He'll keep asking," Emmett said, watching her tuck the note away. "Your father, through Elias, if nothing else." "Let him ask," Odessa said. "A man can ask all he likes. Doesn't obligate me to answer on his schedule instead of mine." "No," Emmett agreed. "It doesn't." Outside, the wind had finally gone still, the deep hush of a Montana night settling over the mended roof and the patched porch step and the fence line still waiting. somewhere past the dark, to be rebuilt post by post. Somewhere north of that fence, Bramwell was sleeping easy, in a house considerably finer than this one, confident his offer would be accepted before spring forced the issue for him. He had no notion yet what he'd invited onto his doorstep. A broken man who still knew his hands' business, and a woman built strong enough to lift a grown man off his feet with one arm, who had just chosen, deliberately, to stand and fight instead of walking away, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she had decided for the first time in longer than she could say that this was a place worth being wanted in. Neither of them slept easy that night, not fully. Too much had shifted in too short a span, a murder, half confessed in a dead man's careful handwriting, a rich man's threat, dressed up as generosity, a brother's plea still hanging unanswered in the cold outside. But when Emmett finally did drift toward sleep, stretched by the banked fire, with his crutch propped close, and his uncle's letter folded safe in his coat, he found the fear had changed shape somehow. Smaller, more manageable. Not because the danger ahead had lessened any, but because, for the first time since the stampede took his leg from him, he wasn't facing it alone. Come spring, a surveyor would ride out to settle a boundary line, 3 years contested. Come spring, Silas Bramwell would learn exactly how far a cripple and a giant were willing to go to keep what belonged to them. But that was spring's problem. Tonight, the fire held, the roof held, and two people who'd met as strangers on a storm-bound bench found themselves, one letter and one hard conversation later, standing considerably closer to something neither of them had a name for yet, and neither of them, for once, in any hurry to go looking for one. February came in gray and grudging, the way it does in that country. Snow still deep in the shadowed places. Mud starting to win the argument everywhere the sun reached its longest. Emmett rode into Larkspur Junction, with the second letter folded inside his coat and a plan that felt some mornings sturdier than others. Find the surveyor. Finish what his uncle started. Get the boundary and the water rights settled in ink. Official, where Bramwell's money couldn't argue it back into fog. Simple. Odessa had called it once. He'd corrected her. Clear, not simple. He understood the difference better now, riding into town it had never once visited while his uncle was alive to invite him. Odessa rode beside him. Same as always, by now. He'd stopped noticing it as a thing worth remarking on the way a man stops noticing his own heartbeat. Not because it's unimportant, but because it's become the rhythm everything else moves to. You're doing it again, she said, partway along the road, not looking at him. Doing what? Turning the letter over in your coat pocket. I can hear the paper crinkling every time your hand drifts toward it. He hadn't realized he'd been doing it. Stopped his hand mid-motion, mildly embarrassed, the way a man gets embarrassed at a habit he didn't know he'd formed until somebody else names it. Bad habit, he admitted. Understandable one, she said. Man's carrying his uncle's dying accusation against the richest cattleman in the territory. I'd be surprised if your hand wasn't drifting toward it every 10 minutes. Doesn't make the ride easier. No, she agreed, but it makes the reason for the ride a good deal clearer. Some fears worth carrying, if the alternative's letting a murderer keep his water and his reputation both. He looked at her, found, not for the first time, that her particular way of saying hard things plain had become one of the steadiest comforts he owned. You've got an answer for everything today, he said. Not an answer, she said. Just a habit of not letting fear finish my sentences for me. Learned that the hard way, same as most things I know. The land office sat squat and unimpressive between a dry goods store and a saloon that had clearly seen better decades. A clerk behind the counter looked up when the bell rang, took one glance at Odessa's height ducking through the doorway, and rearranged his face into the careful blankness of a man deciding not to react. Help you folks? Looking for the surveyor, Emmett said. Walton Cordell filed a request last fall. Boundary dispute. Water rights off Larkin Creek. Something shifted behind the clerk's eyes. Recognition. Followed fast by caution. Cordell, he repeated. You kin? His nephew. Sorry for your loss. The clerk said it the way a man says something he said 100 times and means less each time. Surveyor's Jonas Whitfield works out of a room above the saloon when he's in town, which he is this week, far as I know. Obliged, Mr. Cordell. The clerk's voice dropped, careful, glancing once towards me like the street itself might be listening. That dispute your uncle filed might do you good to know. Silas Bramwell's been in this office more than once since the filing, asking after its status. Man's got friends on the territorial board. Friends who'd just as soon that survey never got finished. Are you telling me not to pursue it? I'm telling you what I'd want told to me. The clerk said if I were fool enough to pick a fight with a man who owns half this valley's credit and most of its silence. Odessa spoke then, first words since they'd entered. And are you that fool, telling us this? The clerk considered her a long moment. No, ma'am, he said. I'm just a man who liked Walton Cordell and didn't much care for how sudden he went. Do with that whatever you please. I never said a word. Jonas Whitfield turned out to be a narrow, careful man. Spectacles perched low on his nose, ledgers stacked around his rented room like fortifications. He listened to Emmett's request with the stillness of a man accustomed to being asked for things he wasn't sure he wanted to give. I remember the filing, he said. Remember, too, that I was 3 days from riding out when word came. Your uncle'd passed. Postponed it. Didn't seem decent surveying a dead man's land before he was even buried. It's not indecent now, Emmett said. It's necessary. I need that boundary settled. Official. In writing. Whitfield removed his spectacles. Cleaned them, slow, on his shirt tail, the particular delaying habit of a man buying himself time to decide something. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Cordell. Bramwell's foreman came to see me. Twice. Made it clear a survey favoring the Cordell claim wouldn't be appreciated. Made it clearer still what unappreciated might come to mean for a man who works alone in open country most of the year. Is that a no? That's a man telling you the risk before he answers. Whitfield put his spectacles back on, looked at Emmett properly for the first time. Your uncle was a fair man. Paid me half up front, the rest on completion, and never once tried to lean on the outcome the way Bramwell has. I don't like being told what my own instruments are supposed to say before I've measured a thing. So, you'll come. I'll come, Whitfield said, on one condition. You keep me alive long enough to finish the measuring. Odessa, from the doorway, said the only thing that needed saying. That part's already handled. Doc Weaver's office smelled of carbolic and old wood smoke, and the man himself looked like he hadn't slept properly since sometime around the day he'd signed Walton Cordell's death as natural. He didn't want to talk. That much was clear from the first minute the way. His eyes kept sliding toward the window, toward the street, toward anywhere. That wasn't Emmett's face waiting for an answer. I told you what I told the county, Weaver said. Heart failure. Man was 71. Hearts fail. Hearts don't usually fail 3 days before a surveyor's due to settle a boundary. The failed heart's owner was about to win, Emmett said. You know that as well as I do, Doc. Better, probably. Weaver's jaw worked. Something old and guilty moved behind his eyes. There were signs, he admitted finally, quiet enough that Emmett had to lean in to catch it. Wrong for a heart complaint. The color of him. The way his hands had gone toward the end. I've seen enough sickness in this territory to know when a thing doesn't add up clean. But I wrote heart failure anyway. Why? Because Silas Bramwell owns the mortgage on this office, Weaver said, and something in him seemed to collapse, finally, under the weight of saying it out loud. Because a doctor who starts asking uncomfortable questions about a rich man's neighbor tends to find his own practice considerably harder to keep running. I'm not proud of it, Mr. Cordell. I've laid awake more nights than I care to count since, wondering what I owed your uncle that I didn't pay. Will you say that in writing? To the territorial office, alongside Whitfield's survey? Weaver was quiet. A long time. I'll say what I observed, he said finally. The color, the hands, the speed of it. I won't put a name to a cause I can't prove with certainty, because I won't have that on my conscience either, accusing a man of murder on suspicion alone. But I'll say the death didn't sit right with me then, and it doesn't sit right with me now. That's the truth, and it's yours to use. It's enough, Emmett said. Thank you, Doc. Don't thank me, Weaver said. Thank me if this ever actually costs Bramwell something. Until then, I'm just a man who finally said out loud what he should have said months ago. He rubbed a hand over his face, tired in a way that went past simple lack of sleep. You want to know the part that keeps me up nights, Mr. Cordell? Your uncle knew, near the end, looked at me with those clear, frightened eyes and said, plain as anything, Doc, write it down as my heart, whatever you believe happened. Don't put my nephew in the crosshairs of a man like Bramwell, over a suspicion you can't prove. He protected you with his last clear thoughts, and I let his protection cost him the truth of his own death being recorded honest. That's what I have to live with, not just the lie. The fact that he asked me to tell it, and I was relieved enough to agree. Emmett sat with that a long moment, something tightening hard behind his ribs. He was protecting me, he said, half to himself. Even then, man loved you more than his own reputation for honesty, it seems, Weaver said, which is a strange thing to inherit when you think on it. Most men leave money, or land, or grudges. Yours left you a lie told out of love, and asked a frightened old doctor to keep telling it until somebody brave enough came along to need the truth more than the safety. Someone did, Odessa said quiet, from where she stood near the door. Two someones, as it happens. Weaver looked at her, then at Emmett, and something in his tired face eased just slightly, like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten. It had a shape separate from his own shoulders. Then I suppose it's past time I helped carry it, too, he said. It was on the ride back toward the homestead, dusk coming down early and blue over the white fields, that a rider fell in alongside them from a stand of pine, unannounced, unhurried, and entirely unwelcome until Emmett recognized the shape of him. Dutch Pruitt. Don't reach for anything, Dutch said, hands visible, empty, raised slightly like a man surrendering, before anyone had accused him of a crime. I'm not here for trouble. Been trying to work up the nerve to find you two for near a month now. You've got a strange way of showing up unarmed, Emmett said. Given the last time we spoke, you were half a step from getting lifted off your feet again. I remember it fine, Dutch said. Been remembering it a good deal, actually. That's part of why I'm here. Odessa said nothing. Watched him with the same flat, unhurried attention she'd given him in the depot, the look that had once made him take 2 steps back into a wall. Say what you came to say, she told him. We haven't got all evening. Dutch's throat worked. I rode fence for Bramwell 2 summers, like I told you. Left his outfit last fall, before your uncle died, Mr. Cordell. Wasn't proud of some of what I saw while I was riding for him, and I've been less proud of myself every week since for keeping quiet about it. What did you see? Bramwell's foreman man named Coy Ellard met with a drifter out past the North Line, week before Walton Cordell took sick. Paid him. Heard the words myself, hiding closer than I ought to have been, on account of I was fixing fence, not 30 yards off, and didn't want to be seen listening. Ellard told the drifter, plain as anything, make sure the old man doesn't cause any trouble before the surveyor comes through. Didn't hear more than that. Didn't want to hear more than that, if I'm honest. But I heard enough to know it wasn't idle talk. The words landed hard, colder than the evening air. Emmett sat with them a long moment, the old anger from the stampede, and the firing both rising up fresh alongside this newer, sharper thing. Why didn't you say something sooner? He asked. Man died in October. It's near March. Because I was scared, Dutch said plain, no dressing on it. Same as I imagine most cowards are scared, when it counts. Bramwell's got reach in this territory. A man who talks tends to find himself without work, without credit, without much of anywhere left to go. I told myself it wasn't my business. Told myself for months. He looked toward Odessa, briefly, something like shame crossing his face. Then I got to thinking about a woman who lifted a man clean off his feet rather than let him keep mistreating people smaller than him. And I figured if she could risk that much for strangers in a train depot, I ought to manage risking something for a dead man I never even knew, seeing as my silence is part of what let his killer walk free this long. Odessa's expression didn't soften exactly, but something in it shifted, acknowledged the way a debt gets marked paid, even when the payment comes late and imperfect. Will you testify? Emmett asked. Same as Doc Weaver's agreed to. Same as Whitfield's survey. I will, Dutch said. Scared or not. Figure it's past time I stopped letting scared make my decisions for me. He shifted in his saddle, looking for the first time since Emmett had known him, less like a man spoiling for a fight, and more like a man simply tired of running from one. For what it's worth, Dutch added. Royal won't back me on this. Still rides for an outfit Bramwell's got dealings with, and he's not fool enough to bite the hand that keeps him fed. But I don't ride for anybody anymore. Left it all behind after the depot, matter of fact. Been doing odd work here and there, saving what I can, trying to figure out what kind of man I want to be now that I'm not spending all my nerve on being cruel to strangers for entertainment. That's a hard kind of honest, Odessa said. Learned it from watching you, Dutch admitted. Didn't expect to. Man doesn't usually learn much of value from getting lifted off his feet by a woman half his size, taller than him. But I've turned that moment over more than most moments in my life, and what I keep landing on is, you didn't hit me. Could have. Had every right to. Way I was talking. But you chose the harder thing instead. Made me feel the weight of what I'd done without giving me the easy out of feeling like a victim of your temper afterward. Took me weeks to understand what you'd actually done there. Once I did, I couldn't rightly go on being the kind of man who'd earned it. Odessa didn't answer that right away. When she did, her voice had gone quieter, less flat than her usual register, something almost gentle threading through it. That's the most decent thing anyone from that depot said to me since, she said. Thank you for saying it. Don't thank me yet, Dutch said. Thank me once I've actually stood up in front of a judge and said it under oath. Words are cheap till then. Words are still a start, Emmett said. Most men never manage even that much. The survey took 3 days. Whitfield worked methodical and unhurried, despite the danger, chains and instruments laid out across land Emmett was starting slowly to think of as genuinely his, not just inherited, but earned, foot by measured foot. Bramwell's riders appeared twice during those 3 days. Watched from a distance both times, close enough to be seen, far enough to claim, if pressed, that they'd only been passing through their own land on legitimate business. Emmett kept his father's knife at his hip and a rifle within reach at all times, propped against whatever fence post or wagon wheel was nearest, and found to his own quiet surprise that his hands, when it came down to it, remembered how to hold a rifle steady just as well as they remembered how to bank a stove or set a shingle. Odessa worked the property, alongside Whitfield's chain-carrying assistant, hauling stakes, holding, measuring lines taut across drifts too deep for an ordinary man to wade through easily, and Emmett found himself, more than once, simply watching her work not out of concern, not out of doubt in her capability, but out of something closer to gratitude that had stopped needing a more complicated name. On the second evening, with Whitfield's assistant asleep by the fire and the day's measurements logged careful in a leather-bound ledger, Emmett and Odessa sat together on the porch step he'd rebuilt with his own hands, watching the last light drain out of a sky gone the color of a healing bruise. You're worried, Odessa said. Not a question. Bramwell's not a man who loses gracefully. Watched him operate for 2 years before the stampede. He doesn't fold. He escalates. Then we'll be ready for the escalation, same as we've been ready for everything else so far. She said it without drama, the way she said most hard truths, and Emmett found the plainness of it, steadying in a way that sympathy never quite managed to be. You're not afraid, he said. Half a question this time. I didn't say that. She looked out at the darkening fields, the fence line a pale scar against the snow. I'm plenty afraid, Emmett. 6 years of watching men, bigger than most and meaner than they had any right to be, doesn't leave a person fearless. It leaves a person who's learned fear doesn't have to be the one holding the reins. That's the second time you've used that particular saying, because it's the truest thing I know. she said. Fear rides along whether you want it to or not. Questions just whether you let it drive. He thought about his own fear, the fear of falling, of being seen as less, of a body that had already betrayed him once, in a stampede, and might someday betray him again, at the worst possible moment. He thought about how much smaller that fear had gotten since the night on the bench, not because the danger in his life had lessened, but because he'd stopped facing it with only his own, one wood, one flesh legs, to stand on. I'm glad you rode this far with me, he said. Simple. True. I'm glad I got asked, Odessa said. Different thing, and better if you're asking which I'd choose. On the third evening, the last stake driven, the last measurement recorded, Whitfield packed his instruments with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd finished honest work despite every incentive to abandon it. Boundaries clear, he said. Creek splits fair, near as makes no difference your uncle's claim on the water rights holds. Mr. Cordell, straight through where Bramwell's dam sits. Man's had no legal right to starve your herd's water this whole while. I'll file it official at the land office tomorrow, alongside whatever else you're bringing forward. Whatever else turned out to be considerable. Doc Weaver's written statement, Dutch Pruitt's sworn account, the survey itself plain and undeniable, and Walton Cordell's own sealed letter, 3 years of careful documentation finally ready to be laid. All at once, in front of a territorial land office that could no longer pretend the matter was simple or settled or safely ignored. That night, Emmett couldn't sleep. He lay awake in the room that had once been his uncle's, staring at a ceiling water-stained but sound now, patched by his own hands and Odessa's, and found his mind circling the way it always circled before anything that mattered. Because tomorrow the filing went in front of men who'd never met Walton Cordell, never known the particular shake of his failing handwriting, never understood what it cost a dying old man to a suspicion he couldn't prove instead of a comfortable lie he could, which meant tomorrow, all of it, the letter, the survey, the doctor's guilt, Dutch's late courage, had to stand on its own, without Emmett there, every hour to explain the weight behind it. What if it wasn't enough? What if a rich man's reach turned out to be longer, even now, than the truth's? He'd seen it happen before, hadn't he? Watched Bramwell thank him kindly for saving 3,000 head, and then discard him 2 weeks later, like the saving had never happened at all. Money had a way of rewriting a man's debts whenever it suited the man holding the money. Except this wasn't the same. He made himself say it, silent, in the dark. This wasn't one broken cowboy against an outfit with nowhere else to turn. This was a doctor's written statement, a licensed surveyor's official filing, a former hand's sworn account, and a dead man's own careful words, all of it gathered independent, all of it pointing the same direction. Until he heard the door. Odessa, in the hall, unable to sleep either, apparently, or simply attuned enough to the particular quality of his silence to know he was lying awake instead of resting. You're doing it again, she said from the doorway, the thinking loud. Can't help it tonight. Didn't ask you to help it, just noting it. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, the lantern light behind her, turning her into a long dark shape against the hallway wall. Whatever happens tomorrow, Emmett, you've already done the hardest part. Gathered the proof. Found the courage in other people to come forward when it would have been easier for every single one of them to stay silent, same as they'd been staying silent for months. That's not nothing. That's the whole of what a man can control. And if it's not enough, then we gather more, she said, simple, like the answer had never been in doubt. We don't stop being right just because one filing doesn't finish the fight in a single afternoon. You've survived worse than a slow court process, Emmett Cordell. So have I. We'll survive this too, one way or the other. He looked at her a long moment, grateful in a way that still didn't have a simple enough name, and found, finally, that the circling thoughts had gone quiet enough to let sleep back in. Get some rest, she said. Big day tomorrow. Man's got to be sharp, standing up against 6 riders, and a lifetime of somebody else's money. You make it sound almost easy. Not easy, she said, echoing words she'd given him before. on a road not so different from this one, just necessary. Good night, Emmett. Good night, Odessa. Bramwell came to the ranch one final time before the filing, and this time he came with 6 riders instead of 3, and this time there was no pretense of a fair offer in his voice at all. You've been busy, he said, reining up at the fence line, a real fence line now, freshly reset, posts standing straight for the first time in years. Been thorough, Emmett said. There's a difference. Filing tomorrow, I hear. Survey. Some fool doctor's letter. And Dutch Pruitt, of all the disloyal, gutless. Bramwell cut himself off, jaw tight, the composure he'd worn like an expensive coat, finally starting to fray at the seams. You understand what you're accusing me of, Cordell. I understand what the evidence says, Emmett replied. Wasn't my job to accuse, just to gather. Territorial office can do the accusing, once they've seen it laid out plain. And if that filing never makes it to the office, the threat hung there, ugly, 6 riders' worth of implication behind it. Emmett felt his pulse pick up, felt the old fear, the fear a broken man carries into every confrontation, the fear that his body might fail him at the exact moment failure would cost the most rise up hot and fast. He didn't let it show. Then Doc Weaver's got a copy, he said, and Whitfield's filed his own with the Territorial Surveyor General. Standard practice, done before he ever rode out here. And Dutch Pruitt's told 3 separate men in Larkspur Junction what he'd told me on the chance something happened to keep him from testifying in person. You'd have to silence half the county to make this go away now, Bramwell. That's not intimidation anymore. That's evidence with too many hands already holding it. Bramwell's horse shifted under him, sensing perhaps something in its rider's mood that the rider himself hadn't quite decided to act on yet. Odessa stepped up beside Emmett. Didn't say anything at first. Just stood, the way she'd stood in the depot that day. The stillness of a person who had already decided exactly how far she was willing to let a threat travel before she answered it with her body instead of her words. 6 riders, she said finally. Against a man with a rifle, he knows how to hold steady. And a woman who's already proven she doesn't need a weapon at all to end an argument. Do the arithmetic on that before you decide whether today's the day you want to test it, Mr. Bramwell. One of the riders, the scarred one, Coy Ellard. Emmett now understood. The very foreman named in Dutch's account shifted uneasily in his saddle. Whatever nerve Bramwell had been counting on from his men seemed to be thinning fast, the weight of what they'd actually be riding into finally settling on shoulders that hadn't signed up for murder charges, only for intimidation. Ellard, Bramwell said, low, urgent. Back me on this. Ellard didn't move his horse forward. Boss, he said, quiet enough that it was clearly meant only for Bramwell, though the whole yard heard it anyway in the winter stillness. I didn't sign on for hanging for a dead old man's water rights. That letter gets read out loud in a courtroom. My name's in it too. The silence that followed Hottofflod was its own kind of verdict. Bramwell looked at his men, looked at the fence line, the rifle, the woman standing unarmed and unbothered in front of 6 riders like their numbers meant nothing at all. And something in his face, the last of the confidence, the last of the certainty that money and reputation would always be enough to win finally, visibly, broke. This isn't finished, he said. But it came out smaller than he meant it to. Everyone in that yard heard the difference. No, Emmett agreed, it's not. Tomorrow it goes in front of the Territorial Land Office, same as planned. After that, it's out of both our hands, Bramwell. That's the part you never accounted for. You built your whole life on being the only one with reach in this valley. Should have accounted for what happens once other people stop being afraid to reach back. Bramwell's eyes moved once more, over the 2 of them, the crippled nephew standing steady on land he'd tried to steal twice over, and the enormous woman beside him, who'd never once raised a hand in anger and hadn't needed to. Something in his expression, watching them, shifted from fury toward something closer to bewilderment, the particular bewilderment of a powerful man realizing, too late, that the people he'd dismissed as easy targets had simply been waiting for him to run out of ways to intimidate them. You're a cripple, he said quieter now, almost to himself. like he was trying to make the old insult mean something again, and finding it had gone hollow in his mouth. And she's... Say it, Odessa said. Flat. Daring him. Bramwell didn't say it. Whatever word he'd been reaching for, he found, in that moment, that he no longer had the nerve to spend it. Get off my land, Emmett said. Both times you've come here, you've come to take something that wasn't yours. This is the last time I'm asking politely. Bramwell turned his horse. This time, when the riders retreated, there was no unhurried swagger left in it. At all just 6 men, riding away from a fight they'd finally understood they couldn't win. Not with force, not with money, not with anything left in Silas Bramwell's considerable arsenal. No shots fired, no blood spilled. Just the truth, finally, weighing more than the threats built to bury it. The filing went through without incident the next morning. Whitfield's survey, Doc Weaver's statement, Dutch Pruitt's sworn account, and Walton Cordell's own careful, dying words laid out together in front of a territorial land office clerk who read through all of it twice before looking up, visibly shaken, and saying he'd need to forward the matter to the marshal's office, in addition to settling the boundary dispute proper. Silas Bramwell was arrested 11 days later, in his own parlor, in front of considerably fewer riders than he'd once commanded. Coy Allard testified against him in exchange for leniency of his own, which surprised no one who'd watched the man's face in that snowy yard the day his nerve finally gave out. The drifter who'd been paid was never found vanished. The way men like that tend to vanish once the money that hired them stops being worth the risk of staying found. But Bramwell's fortune, and his silence about it, had already done most of the work of convicting him in the court of a territory that had quietly hated him for years and only needed permission to say so out loud. Emmett didn't attend the trial, didn't feel the need. Some debts, once collected, don't require watching the collector work. What he did instead, the week the news came down, was sit at his uncle's table, his table now, and write a letter of his own. Short, simple, addressed to no one but the man who'd raised him in silence and died, leaving the truest words he'd ever spoken folded inside an envelope. Finished it, Uncle Walton. Boundaries settled. Water's yours again, mine now, I suppose. Though it never stopped feeling like yours the whole time I was fighting for it. Wish you'd said half of what was in that letter while you still had a voice to say it with, but I heard it anyway. That's what matters, I think. A man doesn't have to say a thing out loud for it to have been true the whole time. He didn't send it anywhere. Didn't need to. Just folded it, same as the others, and set it in the same small wooden box that had started this whole fight, and felt something in his chest ease loose that had been clenched tight since the day the letter first arrived. Odessa wrote her own letter that same week, shorter still, addressed to Elias, care of the address he'd left folded under the porch stone. Tell him I heard about Bramwell. Tell him the land's ours now, clean in writing, and nobody can take it with money or lies. Tell him I'm not ready yet, for whatever it is he wants to say to me. But tell him I'm not never, either. Just not yet. There's a difference, and I think of everyone in that family. You're the one most likely to understand it. She sent that one. Watched it go, at the Larkspur Junction post office, with an expression Emmett couldn't quite read, not peace exactly, but something adjacent to it. A door left open a crack instead of slammed shut for good. You didn't have to send anything, he said, on the ride back. I know, she said. Wanted to anyway. Man's dying, Emmett. Whatever he did, whatever he still owes me, I'd rather he spend what's left of his life knowing the door's cracked than believing he shut it himself for good. That's not for him. That's for me. I don't want to carry a locked door around for the rest of my life and life. Same as I carry this notebook. Some weight's worth setting down, even if you never fully forgive the person who made you carry it. Emmett thought about that a long while, the wagon wheels crunching over hard-packed snow, starting, finally, to give way to mud. That's a generous kind of strength, he said. It's not generosity, Odessa said. It's just tired of hauling more than I need to. Different thing. March gave way to April, slower than either of them expected. but it gave way all the same, the way seasons always do, for people patient enough to outlast the waiting. Word came, eventually, that Bramwell had accepted a plea to avoid the harsher end of what the marshal's office had assembled against him, not murder. In the end, proof of that thin to survive a courtroom, no matter how strongly everyone in the valley believed it true. But conspiracy and fraud, and enough besides to see him stripped of most of his land and all of his standing in a territory that had spent years pretending not to notice how he built his fortune. He'd leave the valley by summer's end, the paper said. Nobody Emmett spoke to in Larkspur Junction seemed inclined to miss him. Coy Allard's testimony, once it came, filled in gaps Dutch's account alone couldn't reach, confirmed the drifter's payment, confirmed the intent behind it, though it stopped short, same as Doc Weaver had, of proving the exact hand that had done the poisoning. Some truths, Emmett was learning, never arrive complete. They arrive close enough, and a person has to decide eventually that close enough will have to be sufficient to build a life on top of. He found, standing in his uncle's kitchen the evening, the news reached him that it was. Odessa's own longer letter to her father went out around that same time. Once the dust of it all had properly settled pages instead of a single paragraph this time, her hand steady across them, saying at last some of what these hard months on a storm-bound bench and a hard-won fight had taught her, but about the difference between what a person owes and what a person chooses to give freely, whether her father understood it in time, whether it changed anything at all in the accounting he'd have to make, with whatever waited for him after, wasn't hers to control anymore. She had set the weight down. That much, at least, was hers to keep. Spring came slow, the way it always does in that country, patient and unhurried, and entirely worth the wait once it finally arrived. The fence stood whole by April, every post reset, every rail true, the work of two people who'd started as strangers on a storm-bound bench and become, somewhere between a dead man's letter and a rich man's downfall, something neither of them had rushed to name, but both of them had long since stopped denying. The herd Emmett bought that spring small to start, a dozen head purchased with what little money remained, after the fight with Bramwell had cost him nearly everything. But the land itself grazed the south pasture freely for the first time in 3 years, drinking from a creek that ran clear and unobstructed now, the dam torn out by court order the same week Bramwell's plea was accepted. Emmett had ridden out to watch it happen. The boards pulled loose one by one, the water rushing forward like it had been waiting the whole time, just to be let go. Odessa had stood beside him that day too, same as she stood beside him, for most things now, and had said only, "Your uncle would have liked." Seeing that, he would have, Emmett agreed. Wish he'd lived to. Maybe he did in the part that matters, she said. Man doesn't finish a fight like that, and then just disappear from it entirely. Some of him still standing right here, in the part of you that wouldn't let it go unfinished. He hadn't had an answer for that. Just reached over and took her hand. The first time he'd done so without a reason attached to it, without a fall to catch or a crutch to hand back, just her hand. In his, because he wanted it there, and because she let it stay. The porch step held now, solid beneath a boot or a crutch alike, and it was there, on a warm evening, with the last of the snow, finally gone from all but the deepest shadows, that Emmett found himself standing beside the bench he'd built to replace the one that used to sag against the porch rail long, wooden, sturdy, built with his own 2 hands, and a set of instructions his hands, it turned out, had known all along. Odessa was already sitting on it, taking up most of it, same as she always would, same as she never once apologized for. Emmett looked at the space beside her. Small. Just enough. "Is this seat taken?" he asked. She looked up at him the same look she'd given him in that frozen depot 5 months before. Direct, unflinching, already knowing the answer before she gave it, and choosing, deliberately, generously, to give it anyway. "It is now," she said. He sat, out past the mended fence, in the long gold light of a Montana evening finally warm enough to trust. The herd was coming home across the pasture slow, unhurried, The way cattle move when nothing in the world is chasing them anymore. Two shadows stretched long across the grass from the porch where Emmett and Odessa sat, watching them come. One shadow tall as a doorframe. One shadow leaning, just slightly, on a piece of wood where a leg used to be. Neither shadow apologized for its shape. Neither needed to. The bench held them both, easy, the way it always had from the very first night, not because either of them had been owed the space, but because, somewhere along a road neither of them had planned on walking together, they'd each decided the other was worth making room for. Not a rescue. Not a cure. Just a man missing a leg and a woman, too large for anyone's comfortable idea of a lady, who'd one kind of panic that never once asked either of them to be smaller than they already were. The sun went down slow behind the mountains. The cattle settled into the home pasture for the night, and on a porch that had nearly broken a man's leg the first day, he tried to stand on it. Two people just sat together in the dark in no hurry at all, having finally arrived exactly where they belonged. The end.